The time lock paradox. Somewhere in the future, engineers build a barrier. Not a wall made of steel or concrete, but something far stranger, a barrier made of time itself. The idea is simple enough on the surface. If time travel ever becomes possible, there will be people who want to go back and change things. Governments will fall, wars will be rewritten, history will become a tool anyone with a machine can reshape. So the engineers of the future decide to prevent this by creating a temporal lock, a mechanism that blocks all time travel before a certain point. Nobody can go back past the lock. The past stays fixed. Problem solved. Except it isn't solved, because the moment you sit with this idea for more than a few seconds, something starts to feel wrong. Here is the problem. Building a temporal lock requires technology that doesn't exist yet. Specifically, it requires knowledge about how time travel works, how wormholes or closed time-like curves or whatever mechanism makes it possible actually function at a mechanical level. You need to understand the thing you are locking before you can lock it. And that understanding, that specific technical knowledge, only exists in a future where time travel has already been developed, tested, and studied long enough to be weaponized, regulated, and eventually locked down. So the future engineers need to travel back in time to install the lock. But the lock they are installing is designed to prevent travel back in time. The tool they need to use is the thing they are trying to stop. Go further. Suppose they find a workaround. Suppose they install the lock without traveling back, using some other method. Maybe they send a signal instead of a person. Maybe they anchor the barrier in the present and let it extend backward automatically. Fine, but now ask what the lock is actually made of. What physical or temporal mechanism creates a barrier in time? Whatever that mechanism is, it had to be invented at some point. And whoever invented it had to understand time travel deeply enough to build something that interacts with it directly. Which means time travel had to be real and functional before the lock was designed. Which means there was a window, however brief, when time travel existed and the lock did not. During that window, someone could have gone back and prevented the lock from ever being built, or prevented the engineers from being born, or stolen the plans for the lock and used them for something else entirely. The lock assumes it can protect a timeline it was built inside. But the timeline it was built inside had to survive long enough to produce the lock first, and nothing guaranteed that survival. There is a version of this that shows up in political philosophy too, though it rarely gets called a paradox. Any institution that tries to make itself permanent faces the same structure. A constitution that cannot be amended still had to be written by someone who could have written it differently. A law that prohibits its own repeal still had to be passed by a body that had the power to pass anything. The protection depends on the thing it is trying to protect against. The lock and the key are made of the same material. What makes the time lock paradox strange is that it is not just about time travel. It is about the deeper problem of using a system to constrain itself. You cannot step outside the timeline to install something that operates on the timeline from outside. You are always working from inside, and anything built from inside carries the vulnerabilities of the inside with it. Physicists who think seriously about closed time-like curves, the technical term for paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, run into related problems constantly. If such paths exist, can they be opened and closed at will? If they can be closed, what closes them? If the closing mechanism exists inside the same space-time as the path, then the path could in principle be used to destroy the mechanism before it operates. Every lock has a keyhole, and a keyhole is an opening. Maybe the future engineers figured all of this out. Maybe there is a version of the time lock that avoids every one of these problems through some physics we have not discovered yet. But the paradox is not really asking whether a time lock is technically possible. It is asking something quieter. Whether any system can ever fully protect itself from the conditions that created it. And if the answer is no, then what does that say about every barrier we have ever believed was permanent? Some philosophers have argued that the time lock problem is actually a special case of a more general impossibility. Any rule that tries to govern its own application runs into this. The rule needs to exist before it can be applied, but its existence had to come from somewhere, and whatever produced it was not yet governed by it. So there is always a gap, however small, between the moment the rule becomes real and the moment it takes full effect, and in that gap, the thing the rule was designed to prevent, could have already happened. Lawyers know this structure well. Retroactive laws are controversial precisely because they try to punish behavior that was not prohibited at the time it occurred. You cannot lock the door after someone has already walked through it and then pretend the lock was always there. Except that is exactly what a temporal lock would have to do. Reach back into a past where it did not exist and make itself present. Whether time travel ever becomes real or not, the shape of this problem is already everywhere. Every security system has a moment before it was installed. Every law has an era before it was written. Every lock was once a plan on paper, unbuilt, undeployed, doing nothing. And in that unbuilt moment, the thing it was meant to stop was already free to move. How do you protect a moment in time that existed before you had the tools to protect it? And if you cannot, does that mean the past is always, in some sense, already gone? The twins' paradox. Picture two people who are identical in every measurable way. Same age, same height, same heartbeat, same number of breaths per minute, born at the same moment, raised in the same place, physically indistinguishable from each other. Now put one of them on a rocket. Not a fast rocket by everyday standards, but something moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Send them out into space and then bring them back. When the rocket lands and the two of them stand next to each other again, something has changed. One of them is younger than the other, not by a little, by years, potentially decades, depending on how fast the rocket traveled and how long the journey lasted. Same starting point, same ending point. Different amounts of time experienced. This is not science fiction. It is one of the most confirmed predictions in all of physics, and it follows directly from Einstein's theory of special relativity, which he published in 1905. Here is the core of what Einstein worked out. Time does not pass at the same rate everywhere. How fast time moves for you depends on how fast you are moving through space. The faster you travel, the slower your personal clock ticks relative to someone who is staying still. At ordinary speeds, this effect is so small, it is basically unmeasurable. But as you approach the speed of light, the difference becomes dramatic. So the twin on the rocket, moving at a substantial fraction of the speed of light, experiences time passing more slowly than the twin who stayed on Earth. When the rocket twin returns, they have aged less, their cells have divided fewer times, their heart has beaten fewer times, their brain has processed fewer moments. From their perspective, the journey might have felt like 2 years. From the Earth twin's perspective, 10 years passed. Both experiences were real. Neither clock was wrong. Time simply moved differently for each of them. Now here is where it becomes a paradox, or at least where it looks like one at first. You might think, why is the situation not symmetric? From the rocket twins' perspective, weren't they the ones staying still while the Earth rushed away and then came back? Relative motion is relative after all. If motion causes time to slow, and if both twins are moving relative to each other, shouldn't both of them age less from the other's point of view? Shouldn't they both be younger when they meet again? But they can't both be younger than each other when they stand in the same room. That is a genuine logical contradiction. The resolution is that the situation is not actually symmetric. The rocket twin had to accelerate to leave, decelerate to turn around, and accelerate again to return. Acceleration is physically different from constant motion. You feel acceleration. You do not feel constant velocity. The rocket twin experienced forces during the journey that the Earth twin did not. That difference in experience is what breaks the symmetry and explains why only one of them ages less. But even knowing the resolution, the reality of it is hard to absorb. Two people, identical at birth, end up at different points in their biological lives because of a journey through space. One of them has effectively traveled into the other's future. Not metaphorically, literally. The younger twin steps off the rocket into a world that has moved further ahead than they have. This has been tested. Not with human twins, because no rocket exists yet that moves fast enough to make the effect large and obvious. But with atomic clocks, which are precise enough to measure tiny differences in the passage of time. Clocks flown on airplanes tick slightly faster than clocks on the ground because they are higher up and therefore in a slightly weaker gravitational field, which also affects time according to general relativity. Clocks on GPS satellites have to be corrected for relativistic effects constantly, or the navigation system would drift and become useless within hours. The effect is real, and it is built into the technology you use every day without thinking about it. What the twins paradox really does is force you to confront something that feels impossible. Time is not a river flowing at the same rate everywhere. It is more like a landscape with varying textures, moving faster in some places and slower in others depending on speed and gravity. Your experience of time is local, personal. It depends on where you are and how fast you are moving, and two people can live through the same calendar period and come out the other side having experienced different amounts of it. There is something almost vertiginous about taking this seriously, not just as a physics fact, but as a fact about experience. The rocket twin did not merely measure a shorter duration, they lived a shorter duration. Their memories of the journey contain less, their body carries less wear, their sense of how much time has passed is genuinely different from their siblings, and both senses are correct. Some people find this liberating. If you could travel fast enough for long enough, you could return to Earth centuries after you left while having aged only a few years yourself. You would be a time traveler in the most literal sense, having skipped forward through history by moving quickly through space. Others find it unsettling for the same reason. You would return to a world where everyone you knew was dead, where your language might be archaic, where everything familiar had been replaced by something you had no context for. The universe does not promise that time will treat everyone equally. Speed has a cost, and the cost is measured in years. If you could choose to travel fast enough to arrive in the future while barely aging, would the version of you that returned still be connected in any meaningful way to the life you left behind? And would that even matter, or would the journey itself become the only thing that was real? Physicists sometimes point out that the twins paradox is not actually a paradox in the strict logical sense. No contradiction occurs. No timeline breaks. Special relativity predicts the outcome cleanly, and experiments confirm it. The word paradox here means something closer to deeply counterintuitive, a result that feels wrong even after you understand why it is right. And that gap between understanding something and feeling its weight is where the twins paradox lives permanently. You can follow every step of the reasoning. You can nod along to the explanation of acceleration breaking the symmetry. You can accept that atomic clocks confirm it and GPS relies on it. And you can still feel, somewhere underneath all of that it should not be possible for two people born at the same moment to end up at different ages. That feeling is not ignorance. It is the friction between the physics of the universe and the intuitions built into a brain that evolved at walking pace, at human scale, in a world where nothing ever moves fast enough for relativistic effects to matter. Your intuitions were shaped by a regime where time is effectively constant. Einstein showed that the regime you live in is a special case, not the general rule. Most of the universe does not share your intuitions about time, and the universe was not designed to make you comfortable. What would it feel like to step off a rocket and meet a version of yourself that had aged 30 years while you aged 2? Not a copy, not a stranger, but the same person who waved goodbye to you at the launch pad, now 3 decades further into a life you shared at the beginning and then diverged from completely. Would you recognize each other? Would you have anything left to say? The Hitler Paradox. Most people, when they first hear about time travel, eventually arrive at the same question. If you could go back and stop one person before they caused unimaginable suffering, would you? And almost everyone answers yes immediately. Of course, it seems obvious. One life against millions. The math feels simple. But the moment you try to think through what actually happens after, the simplicity dissolves. Start with the most basic version. You travel back. You find the person before they have done anything. They are young, perhaps struggling, perhaps ordinary in every visible way. You stop them. Now what? The specific chain of events that led to the catastrophe you were trying to prevent no longer happens, but the conditions that made those events possible are still there. The economic instability, the political fractures, the social grievances, the existing ideological currents that were moving through the culture long before any single person gave them a name and a direction. None of that disappears when you remove one individual. History is not a single thread. It is a fabric. Pull out one fiber and the rest of the weave shifts, adjusts, and continues. Sometimes a different fiber moves into the same position. Sometimes the gap closes in ways you never anticipated. Sometimes removing the most visible cause only reveals that the actual cause was something deeper and older and far harder to locate. Historians have debated for a long time whether great events are driven primarily by individuals or by structural forces. The question has never been fully settled, but most serious historians lean toward a complicated middle ground. Individuals matter. Their specific choices, personalities, and timing shape how events unfold. But they are also products of their moment. They rise because conditions allow them to. Remove them, and conditions may simply produce someone else, possibly someone with the same broad goals and fewer of the specific mistakes that might have limited the damage. So you travel back, you stop the person, and somewhere, in the shifted fabric of that altered history, someone else steps forward. Different face, different name, similar forces behind them. You have not prevented the catastrophe. You have potentially just changed its author. And the new author might be worse, because they might make different mistakes, or fewer of them, or none at all in the places where the original person's particular failures actually limited the harm. This is what makes the Hitler paradox more than a thought experiment about one historical figure. The name is almost incidental. The real question it is asking is whether removing a person from history changes the history or just changes the person at the center of it. And underneath that question is an even harder one. If you could see clearly that removing someone would not prevent the outcome, but only alter its specifics, would you still do it? Would stopping the specific individual matter morally even if the structural outcome remained the same? Is there a difference between the same number of people suffering under a different name and that same suffering never occurring at all? And can you ever know in advance which of those two worlds you are creating? There is another layer that rarely gets discussed. Suppose you go back and you succeed more completely than you imagined. Not just stopping the individual, but somehow dismantling the conditions around them. The suffering you were trying to prevent does not happen. Millions of lives that were lost are now lived. Those people have children. Those children have children. Entire bloodlines that never existed now do. And entire bloodlines that did exist, but only came into being because of the suffering and displacement and migration caused by the events you prevented, now do not. Among the people who no longer exist in your altered timeline is possibly you, or your parents, or someone whose existence was the indirect result of everything terrible that happened. You travel back to prevent a catastrophe, and you prevent it. And in preventing it, you erase a version of the world that, for all its horror, also contained everything that led to you being the person who traveled back to prevent it. The paradox isn't just logical, it's personal. Every person alive today is here because of a specific chain of events that includes tremendous suffering. Wars moved populations, famines forced migrations, atrocities scattered people across continents. The specific meetings, the specific births, the specific lives that produced every person reading this depended on history being exactly the way it was, with all its catastrophes intact. Change any of it, and you do not just alter the past. You alter who exists to experience the future you have created. Some philosophers argue this means we should never travel back to change history, not because the past is sacred, but because we have no way to predict who we are erasing. Others argue the opposite, that the suffering of actual existing people outweighs any obligation to preserve the conditions that produced other people who do not yet exist. Both positions feel right and wrong simultaneously, depending on which direction you think about them from. What the Hitler paradox ultimately reveals is that the desire to fix history is not as straightforward as it feels. You are not a surgeon removing a tumor. You are more like someone trying to reroute a river with their hands. The water does not stop. It finds another path, and you cannot always see where that path leads before you have already committed to the rerouting. If you could go back and change one thing in history, and you knew it would prevent enormous suffering, but also erase the specific chain of events that led to you existing, would the knowledge that you would not be there to see the result change your decision? And if it would, what does that say about whose suffering we actually weigh when we imagine fixing the past? There is one more dimension worth sitting with. When you imagine traveling back to stop someone before they have done anything, you are making a judgment about a person based on what they will do, not what they have done. You are acting on a prediction about a future that has not happened yet, from the perspective of the past where you now find yourself. From inside that past moment, the person you are targeting is not yet guilty of anything. They are a human being who has not yet made the choices that, in your original timeline, led to catastrophe. Maybe in this altered version, they never would have. Maybe the specific circumstances that pushed them toward their eventual actions never fully coalesce in the way you remember. Maybe you are stopping someone who, in this version of events, was going to live an ordinary and unremarkable life. You do not know. You cannot know. You are acting on information from a future that no longer exists, applying it to a present that has already begun to diverge from the history you came from. Every time travel intervention that involves targeting a person based on what they will do rather than what they have done runs into this. Pre-crime, as a concept, is already philosophically troubled in the present. Applied across time, it becomes almost impossible to justify with confidence. You are not punishing someone for what they did. You are preventing someone from doing something they have not done yet, in a timeline that may already be shifting away from the one where they did it. The paradox is not just about history. It is about guilt, prediction, and the ethics of acting on knowledge that belongs to a future that no longer exists. How certain would you need to be before you acted? And is that level of certainty ever actually available to anyone, in any timeline? The second process is today we hold today with recordition, and the ethics of acting on knowledge that belongs to a future that no longer exists. How certain would you need to be before you acted? And is that level of certainty ever actually available to anyone, in any timeline? And yet the pull of the idea does not go away, even knowing all of this, even understanding that removing one person does not remove the conditions that produced them, even accepting that the altered timeline might produce something equally bad or worse. The instinct to go back and try remains. Because doing something, even something uncertain, feels better than doing nothing when the scale of suffering is large enough. That instinct is worth examining. Most of the ethical frameworks we use in everyday life reward action over inaction when harm is at stake. Bystander ethics, duty of care, moral responsibility for preventable harm, all of these push toward intervention, but they were built for situations where you can see the likely consequences of your actions clearly. Time travel, if it were real, would be a situation where the consequences of your actions become less clear the more drastically you act, not more. The bigger the intervention, the more the timeline shifts. The more the timeline shifts, the less your knowledge of the original history applies to the altered one. You are flying increasingly blind, the harder you try to steer, which might be the most unsettling thing the Hitler paradox reveals. Not that changing the past is impossible, but that the more you want to change it, and the more decisively you act on that wanting, the less you can trust your own judgment about whether what you are doing is actually good. The quantum information paradox. Imagine you receive a message from the future. Not a vague warning or a cryptic symbol, but a precise technical document. Equations, diagrams, experimental data, real information with real content. You study it carefully. You run the experiments it describes. Everything checks out. The physics is internally consistent. The predictions it makes about observable phenomena turn out to be correct. Whatever future sent this back clearly understood things your present does not. Now imagine trying to trace where that information came from. You received it from the future, but in the future, where did they get it? They sent it to the past, meaning to you now. So they had it because you eventually figured it out, worked with it long enough to develop it further, and sent an improved version back. But you only had it because they sent it, and they only had it because you eventually sent it forward. Somewhere in that loop, there is no original source. The information simply circulates, improving slightly with each pass, with no moment where it was first created. That is the bootstrap version of this problem, and it is strange enough on its own. But the quantum version goes somewhere even more unsettling. Quantum mechanics places fundamental constraints on how information can be copied, transmitted, and preserved. One of the most important of these is the no-cloning theorem, which says you cannot make a perfect copy of an arbitrary quantum state. If you try to duplicate a quantum system exactly, the act of measuring it to get the information needed for the copy disturbs the original. You cannot have both a perfect copy and an intact original. The information in a quantum system is not freely duplicable. the way a digital file is. Now think about what happens to quantum information when it travels through time. A message sent back through a wormhole or a closed time-like curve would have to pass through regions of space-time where quantum effects are significant. The information in the message is carried by physical systems, particles, fields, something real and quantum mechanical in its behavior. During the journey through the temporal pathway, that information would be subject to all the ordinary processes of quantum decoherence, the tendency of quantum systems to lose their delicate quantum properties through interaction with their environment. By the time the message arrives in the past, the quantum state carrying the information may have been corrupted. Not in the obvious way where some digits are wrong and you get garbled text. In a more fundamental way, where the information itself has become entangled with the environment of the time channel in ways that make it impossible to fully extract. You receive a message, but you cannot be certain the message you received is the message that was sent, because the very act of traveling through time may have altered it at the quantum level in ways that no classical error correction can fix. And here is where it becomes genuinely strange. Suppose the corruption is small but systematic. The information arrives slightly wrong. You work with the slightly wrong version. You develop it further based on the wrong foundation. You send an improved version back to the past. That improved version is also slightly wrong, in a slightly different way, because it was developed from a corrupted foundation. Over many cycles of this loop, the information drifts. Each iteration carries it further from whatever the original correct version was, assuming there ever was one. What you eventually end up with is a body of knowledge that is internally consistent, that makes testable predictions that happen to check out in your local environment, but that may be subtly and fundamentally incorrect in ways that only become apparent when you try to apply it in contexts far from where it was tested. A physics built on time-looped quantum information might work perfectly well in the conditions where you verified it, and fail in ways you cannot predict when pushed beyond those conditions. Some physicists have argued that this problem alone is enough to rule out the possibility of sending information back in time, even if the physical mechanism for time travel existed. The quantum degradation of the message over the temporal journey would make the information unreliable. An unreliable information from the future might be worse than no information at all, because you would have no way to know which parts had been corrupted and which had survived intact. Others take a different view. They argue that the laws of quantum mechanics, applied consistently to closed time-like curves, produce self-consistent solutions in which the information degrades in exactly the way needed to prevent paradoxes. The corruption is not random noise. It is precisely the amount and type of distortion needed to ensure that nothing arriving from the future could be used to create a logical contradiction. Reality, in this view, does its own error correction, not to preserve the information, but to constrain it. That is a remarkable idea. The universe is a self-correcting system that automatically distorts information arriving from the future to prevent it from being used in ways that would break causality. Not because anything is sentient or intentional, but because the physics of closed time-like curves, when worked out consistently, produces exactly the constraints needed to keep the timeline coherent. Whether that is reassuring or disturbing depends on what you were hoping to do with the information. If future knowledge is automatically degraded to prevent it from causing paradoxes, then receiving information from the future is receiving a version of the truth that has been specifically altered to be safe. Safe in the sense of causally consistent, not safe in the sense of accurate. You might receive instructions for building a device that almost works, a theory that is almost right, a warning that is almost precise enough to act on. Almost. And the difference between almost and exactly, in physics, is often everything. What would you do with knowledge from the future if you could never be certain whether it had been quietly distorted during the journey? And if the distortion had been specifically designed to prevent you from using it in ways that would actually change anything? There is a practical version of this problem that does not require time travel to feel the weight of. Every time you rely on second-hand information that has passed through multiple hands, multiple interpretations, multiple translations before reaching you, you face a version of the quantum information paradox. Each step in the chain introduces potential distortion. Each person who passed the information along understood it slightly differently, emphasized different parts, lost track of different details. By the time you receive it, what you have is a version of the original that may be subtly wrong in ways you cannot detect, because you never had access to the original. Historians deal with this constantly. Primary sources are rare. Most of what we know about the past comes through layers of copying, translation, and interpretation. Each layer introduced small errors. Some errors accumulated, some corrected each other by chance. The history we think we know is a reconstruction built from fragments, and the fragments themselves were products of chains of transmission that introduced their own distortions at every link. The quantum information paradox applied to time travel is just a more extreme version of this. The distortion is not introduced by human error or selective emphasis. It is introduced by physics itself, by the fundamental constraints on how information can be copied and transmitted in a quantum universe. And the result is the same. You end up with a version of knowledge that came from somewhere real, but that may no longer accurately represent its source. Maybe the most honest thing you can say about any knowledge that has traveled a long way to reach you, whether through time or through history, or through the telephone game of cultural transmission, is that you are receiving a signal that started somewhere. And the further it traveled, and the more it passed through, the less you can be certain that what arrived is what was sent. That uncertainty does not make the knowledge useless, but it should make you hold it a little more lightly than you might otherwise be tempted to. What would change about how you treat the things you know if you took seriously the possibility that all of them arrived slightly distorted from their original form, and that you have no reliable way to know which parts have drifted and which have survived intact? One more thing worth noting about the quantum information paradox specifically. It points at a deep tension between two things we tend to assume go together: physical possibility and epistemic accessibility. Just because something is physically possible does not mean the information about it can be extracted, transmitted, and used. Quantum mechanics is full of cases where a physical state exists in principle but cannot be fully known in practice, not because of limitations in our instruments, but because of fundamental features of how physical systems work. Time travel, if it were possible, might be another such case. The physical pathway might exist, the mechanism might function, and yet the information that traveled through it might be so degraded by the journey that nothing useful could be extracted. You could have a working time channel and still find that sending knowledge back through it was effectively impossible, not because the channel blocked the information, but because the information could not survive the trip intact. That would be a strange kind of futility, a door you can open that nothing worth sending can pass through unchanged. Physicists who work on the theory of closed time-like curves sometimes describe solutions where information can be sent back, but only in forms that are self-consistent, meaning forms that do not produce paradoxes. The self-consistency requirement automatically filters out any information that would change the past in ways that contradict the present. What gets through is only what was always going to get through, which means the future cannot actually tell you anything you were not already going to figure out on your own. If that is right, then the information paradox resolves into something almost philosophical. You can receive messages from the future, but only messages that confirm what you were already going to discover. The future cannot accelerate your knowledge, it can only echo it back. And an echo, by definition, tells you nothing you did not already know. The temporal loop paradox. Imagine waking up to the exact same morning. Not similar, identical. The same quality of light through the same window. The same sounds from the street below, the same thought forming in your mind before you are fully conscious. You get up, you go through the day, every conversation lands exactly as you remember it landing. Every choice you make leads to exactly the same next moment. And at the end of the day, something resets. You wake up again, same morning, same light, same sound, same thought. At first it would feel like a memory problem, then it would feel like a dream. Then, after enough repetitions, it would start to feel like something much more disturbing, like the world has a shape you were never told about. The temporal loop paradox is one of the oldest ideas in time travel thinking, and it has been explored in philosophy, physics, and storytelling for as long as people have been seriously considering what it would mean for time to behave strangely. But underneath the familiar surface of the repeating day is a cluster of genuinely hard questions that do not have easy answers. Start with the most basic one. If time loops, do you know it is looping? In most fictional treatments, the person inside the loop eventually accumulates memories across iterations. They remember yesterday's loop, even though yesterday reset. This gives them a kind of advantage, learning from each cycle, adjusting their behavior, using the repetition to gradually improve their situation. But this version already contains a hidden assumption that the loop carries something forward, that there is a continuity of experience or memory that persists across what should be a complete reset. But if the loop is truly a loop, if time genuinely returns to the same starting point with everything reset, then nothing should carry forward. Your memories of previous iterations would reset with everything else. You would have no way of knowing you had been through this before. You would wake up on the same morning for the 1000th time with no sense of having woken up on it before. Every iteration would feel like the first. Every conversation would feel fresh. Every choice would feel open and undetermined. From the inside, a true temporal loop would be completely indistinguishable from a single day. You would never know. You would make the same choices, not because you were compelled to, but because you remembered making them yesterday and wanted to make them again, except you would not remember, because the memory would have reset with everything else. The loop would be invisible to anyone inside it. This creates a strange epistemic situation. How would you ever know if you were in a loop? You cannot compare this morning to previous mornings if the memory of previous mornings was erased. You cannot notice that things are happening exactly as they happened before if you have no access to a before. The loop is, in principle, undetectable from the inside if it is truly complete. Some physicists who work on closed time-like curves argue that this is actually a feature rather than a bug. A self-consistent loop does not require anyone inside it to know it is a loop. The physics just repeats. The people inside experience each iteration as normal, making their normal choices, living their normal day, and then the reset occurs and it happens again. No one suffers. No one is trapped in any meaningful experiential sense. The loop simply is, quietly, without anyone needing to be aware of it. But even that relatively benign description gets strange when you push it. If every iteration is identical, if every choice leads to the same outcome because it always has and always will, what does it mean to say the people inside are making choices at all? Are they choosing, or are they executing a script that was fixed the moment the loop was established? Free will, or the appearance of it inside a deterministic structure? This is where the temporal loop paradox connects to some of the deepest problems in philosophy of mind and metaphysics. If your choices are genuinely free, then in principle you could make a different choice on any given iteration. But if the loop is truly closed, then you never do. Every iteration, you make the same choice. Not because you are forced to, but because for whatever combination of reasons, the same choice emerges from the same person in the same circumstances every time. Maybe that is what free will always was, the same person in the same circumstances making the same choice, not because the choice was predetermined, but because the person is who they are and the circumstances are what they are. The loop just makes this visible in a way that ordinary linear time does not. Or maybe the loop reveals that there was never any real openness in the situation, that what felt like choice was always just a process playing out according to fixed rules. That the loop is not creating determinism but exposing it. You cannot answer this from inside the loop, because from inside the loop, everything feels exactly as it always felt. Open, present, real. The loop does not announce itself. It does not change the texture of experience. It just makes the same texture repeat, invisibly, indefinitely. There is another version of the temporal loop that is even harder to think about. Not a loop that repeats daily, but one that repeats on a cosmic scale. Some cosmological models, particularly certain cyclic universe proposals, suggest that the entire history of the universe might repeat. Not identically, necessarily, but in broad strokes. The universe expands, reaches some maximum state, contracts or decays, and then begins again, producing a new universe with similar physics and similar initial conditions. If that were true, then every civilization that has ever existed, everything anyone has ever thought or felt or built or lost, might have happened before. Not once, an uncountable number of times, and will happen again. And the version of you lying here right now, drifting towards sleep, has drifted towards sleep in exactly this way, in a universe statistically similar to this one, more times than there are atoms in the observable universe. Nietzsche called this eternal recurrence and used it as a philosophical stress test. If your life repeated exactly, forever, could you affirm it? Could you choose to live it the same way, knowing it would loop? The temporal loop paradox takes that question out of the philosophical register and into the physical one, not as a thought experiment about how to live, but as a genuine possibility about how time might be structured. And the strangest part is that you would never know. The loop, if it exists at any scale, leaves no trace you can read from inside it. You just keep waking up, keep going through the day, keep arriving at what feels like the end, which is also the beginning. If your life was already looping, and you had no way to detect it, would anything about how you are living it right now be different? And if the answer is no, what does that tell you about what the loop would actually mean? There is one more layer that makes the temporal loop paradox particularly resistant to resolution. Most paradoxes have a structure where you can at least identify what the contradiction is, even if you cannot resolve it. The grandfather paradox produces a logical impossibility. The Bootstrap Paradox produces an object with no origin. The Predestination Paradox produces an attempt to prevent something that the attempt itself causes. Each of these has a clear shape you can point to. The temporal loop paradox is different. On the surface, it might not be a paradox at all in the logical sense. A loop can be perfectly self-consistent. Every event causes the next, which causes the next, which eventually causes the first. No contradiction, no impossibility, just a closed circle of causation that goes around and around without ever breaking. What makes it a paradox is subtler. It is the paradox of meaning inside a closed structure. If everything repeats, what does progress mean? If every choice leads to the same outcome, what does agency mean? If every experience has already happened and will happen again, what does novelty mean? None of these questions has a logical contradiction at its center, but all of them point at something that feels deeply wrong about a universe organized as a loop. Maybe the feeling of wrongness is just an intuition artifact, a bias built into minds that evolved in a linear time environment and cannot comfortably model circular causation. Maybe loops are perfectly fine and the discomfort is just unfamiliarity. Or maybe the discomfort is pointing at something real. That meaning requires openness. That agency requires genuine alternatives. That experience requires the possibility of something genuinely new. And that a closed loop, however physically consistent, forecloses all of these in a way that makes the experiences inside it, however vivid they feel from the inside, somehow less than they appear. You cannot resolve this from where you are. You are inside a timeline that feels linear and open and full of genuine possibility. Whether that feeling accurately represents the structure of time, or whether it is just what it feels like to be inside a loop, you genuinely cannot tell. And maybe that is the only honest place the temporal loop paradox can leave you. Tonight, included. The conservation of mass paradox. Physics has rules. Not suggestions, not guidelines, but rules that appear to hold everywhere we have ever looked, at every scale we have ever been able to examine. Among the most fundamental of these is the conservation of mass and energy. Matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. They can change form, transform from one kind of thing into another, but the total amount in a closed system remains constant. This is not a preference of the universe. It is, as far as anyone can tell, a non-negotiable feature of how physical reality works. Time travel, if it were possible, would immediately create a problem for this rule. Suppose you step into a time machine in the year 2035. You and the machine weigh a combined total of some specific amount of mass. You activate the device. You travel back to the year 1985. Suddenly, in 1985, that mass exists. It did not exist there a moment before. You arrived. You brought it with you. But the mass you are composed of already existed in 1985. You were made of atoms, and those atoms, in their earlier arrangements, were already part of the world in 1985. They were in food, in soil, in the air, in other organisms. They were going through their ordinary processes, participating in the chemistry and physics of the mid-1980s, doing what atoms do. And now here you are, arriving from 50 years in the future, made of those same atoms or others, adding your mass to a timeline that already has a complete and conserved accounting of mass and energy. Where did the extra mass come from? From your perspective, you brought it. You carried it through time. But from the perspective of the 1980s, matter has appeared from nowhere. The total mass of the universe in that era just increased, not by a lot, by the amount of you and your machine, but increased nonetheless. And conservation of mass says that cannot happen. Now multiply this across every time traveler who ever visits the past. Every person who goes back in time adds their mass to an earlier era. If time travel becomes common, the past becomes steadily heavier over time, accumulating contributions from every future traveler who decides to visit. The past would be measurably denser with matter than the future from which those travelers came, because the travelers themselves are no longer in the future and are now also in the past. This creates a compounding problem. If mass accumulates in the past, the physics of the past changes. More mass means more gravity. More gravity means different orbital mechanics for planets, different rates of geological processes, different conditions for the development of life. Visitors from the future, simply by arriving, would be subtly altering the physical conditions of the eras they visit. Some physicists argue that the solution lies in assuming time travel must be energy neutral, that the energy required to send mass back in time is exactly equivalent to the mass being sent, and that this energy is extracted from the future era and deposited in the past, leaving the total conserved across the full four-dimensional structure of space-time. The accounting balances when you add up all of space and time together rather than looking at any single moment. This is mathematically coherent, but physically strange. It requires thinking of the universe not as a sequence of moments, but as a single four-dimensional object, with all of its moments equally real and equally present. The past is not gone. The future is not yet to come. All of time exists simultaneously as a structure, and mass energy is conserved across that structure as a whole, rather than within each moment separately. Physicists call this the block universe view, and it has genuine support from general relativity, which treats time as a dimension of space-time rather than something categorically different from space. But it is deeply counterintuitive, because it requires accepting that the past still exists, fully and completely, somewhere in the four-dimensional block, and that future moments are equally real, even though you have not reached them yet. If the block universe is real, and conservation holds across the whole four-dimensional structure, then time travel does not violate conservation laws. It just moves mass around within the block, redistributing it between different temporal locations, the way ordinary movement redistributes it between spatial locations. You are not creating mass by going back in time any more than you are creating mass by walking from one room to another. But this resolution introduces its own strangeness. If all moments are equally real and the past still exists, then the version of you sitting in 1985 is as real as the version of you sitting in 2035. Both exist, both have mass, both are part of the block, and when you travel back, you are not the same instance of matter appearing in two places. You are a single thread of matter, tracing a path through the four-dimensional block that happens to loop backward through time. Which raises the question of what happens to the physical you that is sitting in 2035 while the physical you is also sitting in 1985. Are you in two places simultaneously? Is that allowed by physics? And if the block universe says yes, both moments of you are real, then what does it mean for the you in the present to have traveled anywhere at all? The conservation of mass paradox does not just challenge time travel. It challenges our assumptions about what kind of thing time is and what kind of thing matter is. If matter is conserved across time as well as space, then the universe is less like a sequence of events and more like a four-dimensional object in which everything that has ever happened or will ever happen already exists, fully formed, waiting only for a consciousness moving through it to experience it as unfolding. And if that is the structure of reality, then what you are doing right now, moving through time at the ordinary rate of 1 second per second, is not categorically different from a time traveler skipping back 50 years. Both are trajectories through the block, both are real. Both preserve mass. The only difference is the path. What would change about how you experience time if you truly believe that every moment you have ever lived still exists, fully intact, as real as this one, somewhere in the structure of space-time? And what would it mean for a moment to be gone if it was never actually gone, only behind you on a path you cannot walk backward. There is a related problem that gets less attention than the mass question, but is arguably more disorienting. When you travel back in time, you carry information with you as well as mass. Your memories, your knowledge, your understanding of how events unfolded. All of this is physically encoded in your brain as patterns of neural connections and electrochemical states. And all of it represents knowledge of the future, from the perspective of the era you have arrived in. In the present moment of 1985, none of that information exists anywhere in the world. It cannot. The events that produced it have not happened yet. The people who will participate in those events are still young or not yet born. The technologies that will be developed are still theoretical or unimagined. Everything you know about the 50 years between 1985 and 2035 is information that, according to the conservation of information as understood through quantum mechanics and thermodynamics, should not be present in 1985. But you are there, and you carry it all. If information is physical, which modern physics strongly suggests it is, then your brain arriving in 1985 is not just a mass problem, it is an information problem. You have introduced into the past a quantity of information that should not be there, information that was generated by processes that have not happened yet in this era. Where did that information come from? From the perspective of the conservation laws of 1985, from the future. But the future does not yet exist in 1985, or at least it has not happened. You are carrying a physical record of events that, according to the timeline you have arrived in, are 50 years away. The conservation of mass paradox is really the conservation of everything paradox. Mass, energy, information, entropy, all of the quantities that physics says must be accounted for across a closed system, suddenly have an unaccounted source the moment a traveler arrives from another time. And the only resolutions involve either accepting that time travel is impossible, or accepting that the universe is a very different kind of object than it appears to be from inside a single moment moving forward. Which one is more disturbing is probably a matter of what you were hoping for when you started thinking about it. One more angle worth considering: the conservation laws in physics were discovered and confirmed by observing the universe as it exists along a single forward-moving timeline. We have never had the opportunity to check whether they hold across temporal jumps, because no temporal jumps have been observed. Everything we know about conservation of mass, energy, and information comes from systems that move forward through time in the ordinary way. It is at least conceivable that the conservation laws, as we understand them, are a special case that applies to forward-moving processes, but that break down or transform into something else when time is traversed non-linearly. Maybe there is a broader version of conservation that encompasses time travel without contradiction, a law we have not yet discovered because we have never been in a situation where we needed it. Or maybe the conservation laws are as absolute as they appear, which would mean time travel is not just difficult, but physically impossible in principle, not forbidden by engineering limitations, but by the basic accounting of reality. Either way, the conservation of mass paradox is a reminder that time travel is not just a logistical puzzle. It is a physical one, and the physics of it runs into some of the deepest and most reliable truths about how the universe keeps track of itself. Something has to give. Either the conservation laws bend, or the block universe is real, or time travel is impossible. Pick whichever option feels least uncomfortable. None of them are comfortable. The Predestination Paradox. There is a version of time travel that does not feel like escape at all. You do not go back to change anything. You go back because you have to, because the thing you are trying to prevent is the very thing your going back causes, and by the time you understand that, it is already too late to stop it. The loop has already closed before you realize you are inside one. The Predestination Paradox is what happens when free will and fixed outcomes collide in a time travel scenario, and the collision produces not a contradiction, but something worse, a perfect trap. Every action leads exactly where it was always going to lead. Every attempt to escape the outcome becomes one of the mechanisms that guarantees it. Here is the cleanest version of the shape. You learn that a disaster will occur on a specific date. You travel back in time to warn people, to prevent it, to do whatever needs doing to stop the terrible thing from happening. You arrive in the past. You take your best shot at intervention. You warn people, issue alerts, try to change the sequence of events. And then, through a chain of consequences you did not foresee, your actions become the cause of the very disaster you were trying to prevent. The panic you triggered leads to the evacuation that leads to the accident. The warning you issued creates the conditions for the thing you warned against. Your interference was not a deviation from the timeline. It was a required part of it. The disaster always included you. Your presence was already in the causal chain, waiting for you to arrive. What makes this different from ordinary tragic irony is that the loop is closed. You did not just fail to prevent the outcome. You caused it. And you caused it by trying to prevent it. And you tried to prevent it because you knew it was going to happen. And you knew it was going to happen because it did happen, partly because you tried to prevent it. The causation does not have a beginning you can point to. It is circular all the way around. This is not a contradiction in the logical sense. Everything is consistent. The timeline holds together. Every event has a cause, and every cause produces an effect. The loop is internally coherent. What it violates is something more intuitive than logic. It violates the sense that your intentions should have some relationship to your outcomes, that trying to prevent something should at least give you a chance of preventing it. In the Predestination Paradox, trying to prevent something is precisely what prevents you from preventing it. The harder you try, the more thoroughly you become part of the mechanism you were trying to stop. Ancient literature is full of stories that have exactly this shape, which suggests that humans have been thinking about predestination and self-fulfilling prophecy for as long as they have been telling stories about fate. The oracle tells a king that his son will kill him. The king sends the son away to prevent it. The son grows up not knowing who he is, travels, encounters an older man at a crossroads, kills him in an argument. The older man was the king. The exile that was meant to prevent the prophecy was the event that made it inevitable. Every step taken away from the predicted outcome was a step toward it. Time travel just gives this ancient shape a physical mechanism. Instead of fate or prophecy, you have a closed, time-like curve. Instead of oracles, you have direct knowledge of future events. Instead of a king making decisions that backfire, you have a traveler making interventions that guarantee exactly the outcome they were designed to prevent. The philosophical problem at the center of the Predestination Paradox is whether free will can exist inside a causally closed system. If the loop is closed, if every event was always going to happen the way it happened, then every choice made by every person inside the loop was always going to be made. The traveler was always going to travel back. The warning was always going to be issued. The panic was always going to follow. The disaster was always going to occur. Not because anyone was compelled, not because anyone had no experience of choosing, but because the choices made by people exercising their ordinary human agency happened to be exactly the choices required to close the loop. Free will and predestination coexist in this scenario not by resolving their tension, but by making it invisible. You feel like you are choosing. The choice is real in every experiential sense. And yet the outcome was fixed. Not because you were forced, but because you, being who you are, in the circumstances you found yourself in, made exactly the choice you were always going to make. The Predestination Paradox does not prove that free will is an illusion. It just demonstrates that even genuine free will, exercised by a real person with real intentions and real understanding of their situation, can produce outcomes that were fixed in advance, not by any external force, but by the causal structure of a closed system. This should feel familiar even without time travel. How many times have you made a choice that led, through a chain of unforeseeable consequences, to exactly the outcome you were trying to avoid? How often has the specific nature of your avoidance strategy been the thing that made the avoided outcome more likely? How often has knowing something was coming made you more likely to cause it? The Predestination Paradox applied to time travel is just the most extreme version of a structure that appears throughout ordinary human experience. The mechanism is more dramatic, the loop is more explicit, but the shape is recognizable. You try to prevent something, and the trying is part of what makes it happen. What makes the time travel version more disturbing is the completeness of the trap. In ordinary life, there is always some chance that a different choice would have produced a different outcome, even if you cannot be certain. The causal chains are long and complex and not fully visible. Maybe if you had done something slightly different, the outcome would have been different too. You cannot know for sure that your attempt to prevent something was what caused it. In the predestination paradox, with a closed time-like loop, the trap is complete. The loop closes perfectly. There is no uncertainty about whether your intervention caused the outcome. It did. You know it did. You can trace the causal chain all the way around. And knowing this does not help you escape it, because you are already inside it. The knowledge of the trap does not provide any exit, because the trap includes the knowledge. You know you are going to cause the disaster. You know this because it already happened and you watched it happen before you traveled back. And now you are in the past, about to do the things that caused it, knowing you are about to cause it, unable to do anything different because any different action would produce a different causal chain that does not close the loop, and a loop that does not close is a paradox rather than a predestination, which raises its own problems. The predestination paradox is what a perfectly deterministic universe looks like from the inside of a time machine. Everything is caused, everything is consistent, nothing is impossible, and nothing can be changed, not because change is forbidden, but because every attempted change was always part of the chain that produced the outcome that prompted the change that was always going to fail to change it. If you learned that something you were about to do would cause something terrible, but also learned that trying to prevent yourself from doing it would cause something equally terrible through a different chain, what would the experience of making a choice in that moment actually feel like? And would it feel different from any other choice you have ever made? There is a version of the predestination paradox that operates at an even more personal scale than the disaster scenario. Imagine traveling back to a moment earlier in your own life, not a historical event, not a public catastrophe, but a private turning point. A conversation that changed the direction of your life, a decision you regret. A moment where, if you had said something different or chosen differently, everything afterward would have been different. You go back, you appear. You try to intervene, to give your past self the information or perspective that would lead to a different choice. And your past self, seeing you, hearing you, understanding what you were trying to say, makes exactly the choice they always made. Because your past self is still the person they were at that moment, with all the fears and beliefs and blind spots and context that produced the original choice. Adding a visitor from the future to the scene does not remove those things. It adds a strange element to an already complex situation. And your past self, processing the strangeness, integrates it and still arrives at the same destination. The predestination paradox at the personal scale is that you cannot change yourself from the outside. You are, in the end, the product of everything that happened to you, including whatever intervention your future self attempted, and that you, in the past, ultimately absorbed without it changing your fundamental trajectory. Which might be the most honest thing the predestination paradox has to say. Not about time travel, but about change in general. External interventions, however well-intentioned, however dramatic, however perfectly timed, do not automatically produce internal transformation. The person receiving the intervention is still the person they were. And the person they were may simply be someone who, at that moment, made that choice. The loop closes not because of fate, it closes because of character. And character, apparently, is more stable across time than most of us would like to believe. And yet, the predestination paradox does not quite fully close even here, because it depends on an assumption that the loop is truly closed, that every timeline produces exactly the same outcome, regardless of what any individual inside it attempts. That assumption may not hold universally. Some versions of time travel physics allow for self-consistent loops that are not strictly identical across iterations. Small variations might be possible as long as they do not create logical contradictions. The loop might be somewhat flexible, allowing for minor differences in how events unfold, even while the major structural features remain fixed. If that is right, then the predestination paradox is less absolute than it appears. You might not be able to prevent the disaster, but you might be able to change which specific people are harmed, which specific consequences ripple outward, which specific details of the aftermath unfold differently. The large-scale outcome is fixed, the fine-grained texture of it is not. That is cold comfort, obviously. If you travel back to prevent a catastrophe and find you cannot prevent it, the ability to tweak the details does not feel like much of a consolation prize, but it is something. It is the difference between a universe that is absolutely locked and one that is constrained in its broad outlines while still allowing for some genuine variation within those constraints. Whether that variation is enough to constitute meaningful agency is a question nobody has answered to everyone's satisfaction. Maybe it depends on what you think meaningful agency requires. If it requires the ability to change the major outcomes, then no, the variation is not enough. If it requires only that your choices have some genuine effect on something, then maybe the fine-grained texture is sufficient. The predestination paradox does not resolve this. It just puts the question in its sharpest possible form and leaves you sitting with it in the dark. The Polchinski Paradox. Most time travel paradoxes involve people. They involve choices, intentions, motivations, the messy human machinery of deciding and acting and regretting, which makes them easy to complicate. Maybe the traveler could have chosen differently. Maybe the chain of consequences was not as inevitable as it seemed. Maybe free will introduces enough flexibility into the system to dissolve the paradox on closer inspection. Joseph Polchinski was not interested in people. He was interested in billiard balls. In 1990, Polchinski, a theoretical physicist, posed a version of the time travel paradox that stripped out all the human messiness and reduced the problem to its bare physical core. No motivations, no choices, no psychology. Just a ball, a wormhole, and the laws of physics. Here is the setup. Imagine a wormhole, a hypothetical tunnel through space-time that connects two different locations. Now imagine a special version of this wormhole that connects not just two different locations in space, but two different moments in time. One end of the wormhole is positioned slightly in the past relative to the other, by a few seconds, say, long enough for a billiard ball to travel through one end and emerge from the other a short time before it entered. You set a billiard ball rolling toward the wormhole entrance. At the right angle and speed, the ball enters the wormhole, travels through it, and emerges from the exit end, a few seconds in the past. Now there are two balls on the table simultaneously, the original ball rolling toward the entrance, and the ball that just emerged from the exit, which is the same ball but displaced a few seconds back in time. Here is where it gets complicated. The ball that emerged from the exit is now rolling across the table, and its trajectory, calculated from the geometry of the setup, carries it directly into the path of its younger self, the ball that is still rolling toward the wormhole entrance. The two balls collide. The collision deflects the younger ball. Because of the deflection, the younger ball no longer enters the wormhole at the right angle. Instead, it misses the wormhole entrance entirely. But if the younger ball misses the wormhole, it never travels back in time. It never emerges from the exit. And if it never emerges from the exit, there is no older ball on the table to collide with the younger one. And if there is no collision, the younger ball rolls straight toward the wormhole entrance, enters it, travels back in time, emerges from the exit, and collides with its younger self. The timeline ties itself into a knot. The collision prevents the ball from entering the wormhole, which prevents the collision, which allows the ball to enter the wormhole, which causes the collision indefinitely. This is the Polchinski Paradox, and unlike many thought experiments about time travel, it received serious mathematical treatment from physicists who were genuinely interested in whether the physics of closed time-like curves was consistent. What they found was remarkable. The paradox does not necessarily mean that time travel via wormhole is impossible. It means that if wormholes connecting different times exist and a billiard ball is aimed at one, there will not be one unique self-consistent solution to the ball's trajectory. There will be multiple self-consistent solutions, different possible trajectories for the ball that do not lead to contradiction. Fernando Echeverria, Gunnar Klinkhammer, and Kip Thorne worked this out in detail in the early 1990s. They found solutions in which the older ball grazes the younger ball rather than hitting it dead on. The glancing collision deflects the younger ball by just enough to change its entry angle into the wormhole, which changes the trajectory of the ball that emerges from the exit, which produces exactly the glancing collision that caused the adjustment. The loop is self-consistent. No paradox, no contradiction, just a ball that follows a slightly curved path into the wormhole because of a collision with itself that was caused by its own future trajectory. This resolution is both reassuring and deeply strange. Reassuring because it suggests that the universe can handle time travel without logical breakdown. Strange because the solution involves the universe selecting, from among many possible trajectories, the specific one that closes the loop consistently. Not randomly, not arbitrarily, but deterministically, through the physics of the wormhole and the collision, arriving at the exact deflection needed to produce the exact collision that caused the exact deflection. The universe, in this picture, is doing something very specific. It is enforcing self-consistency, not through any active mechanism, not through any force or field dedicated to preventing paradoxes, but simply through the mathematics of how trajectories work in curved space-time. The ball ends up on the self-consistent trajectory not because anything pushes it there, but because, of all the trajectories available to it, the self-consistent ones are the ones that actually work out. The inconsistent ones collapse, the consistent ones persist. This connects to something physicists call the Novikov self-consistency principle, proposed by Russian physicist Igor Novikov around the same time. The principle states that the only events that can occur near closed time-like curves are those that are self-consistent with the global history of the universe. Anything that would create a paradox simply does not happen, not because of any prohibition, but because the mathematics of the situation does not admit a solution for it. The billiard ball, in the Polchinski scenario, illustrates this principle with unusual clarity because the physics is simple enough to work out explicitly. You can actually calculate which trajectories are self-consistent and which are not, and the self-consistent ones are the ones that are realized. What this means for more complex scenarios involving people is much harder to say. Human behavior is not as cleanly calculable as billiard ball trajectories. The space of possible actions is vastly larger, the causal chains are longer and more entangled, and people, unlike balls, can change their minds. But the underlying principle might still apply. If the Novikov self-consistency conjecture is correct, then any attempt by a time traveler to do something that would create a paradox would simply fail, not through any external intervention, but because the self-consistent outcome is the only one the physics actually produces. The traveler would find themselves unable to complete the paradox-producing action, not because they were stopped, but because the universe, calculating all the causal chains simultaneously, settles on a solution in which the action does not occur. This is a strange kind of freedom. You are not constrained. You are not forbidden. The universe simply does not produce a solution in which you succeed at the paradox-producing thing. And from the inside, you might experience this as ordinary failure. You tried to do something, and it did not work out, not because anything stopped you, just because it did not work out. How much of ordinary failure, in a universe where closed time-like curves might exist somewhere, is actually the universe selecting for self-consistency without anyone noticing? And would you want to know if that were the explanation for something that had not worked out for you? Some physicists find the self-consistency principle deeply elegant. It suggests that time travel does not break physics. It just imposes an additional constraint on which histories are physically realizable. Others find it unsatisfying in a different way. If only self-consistent histories are realized, then in some sense, everything that happens in a universe with closed time-like curves was always going to happen exactly that way. The self-consistency requirement selects the history before it unfolds, not before in time, because that phrasing breaks down in a universe with temporal loops, but in some logical sense before, in the sense that the physics prefers certain outcomes and the others simply do not occur. That starts to look less like physics and more like fate. And the difference between those two things, in a universe governed by Novikov self-consistency, may be smaller than it feels. What does it mean for your choices to be free, if the universe has already, in some atemporal sense, calculated which version of your choices are consistent with everything that will ever happen, and is only producing the consistent ones? There is one more aspect of the Polchinski paradox that deserves attention, and rarely gets it. The original setup involves a billiard ball aimed at a wormhole, and the analysis focuses on whether self-consistent trajectories exist. The answer, it turns out, is yes, and there are actually infinitely many of them. An infinite family of possible trajectories, all of which produce self-consistent collisions. This is mathematically interesting, but physically troubling. If there are infinitely many self-consistent solutions, which one does the universe choose? Classical physics with a unique trajectory for every set of initial conditions would select one. But the presence of a closed time-like curve apparently creates a situation where the initial conditions do not uniquely determine the outcome. Multiple futures are all equally consistent with the past. This is not the same as quantum mechanical indeterminacy, where probabilities determine which of several outcomes occurs. It is something different. A breakdown of the determinism that classical physics assumes operates even in a universe with time travel. The billiard ball's trajectory, in the presence of the wormhole, is simply not uniquely determined by its starting position and velocity. Multiple paths are all equally valid, which means time travel, even without creating paradoxes, would introduce a new kind of indeterminacy into classical physics. Not the quantum kind, not the kind that comes from inherent uncertainty about microscopic states, but a macroscopic, classical indeterminacy that comes purely from the topology of space-time. A billiard ball on a table with a time loop wormhole does not have a single definite trajectory even in principle. Reality cannot make up its mind, and nothing in the mathematics tells you which of the infinitely many self-consistent solutions is the one that actually happens. Maybe that is the real paradox. Not that time travel causes contradictions, but that it causes indeterminacy where classical physics promised certainty. The ball rolls toward the wormhole, and the universe, for once, cannot calculate a unique answer. And if that is what a simple billiard ball does to classical physics, what would a person do? Polchinski himself was not primarily a time travel theorist. He was a string theorist who made foundational contributions to the understanding of D-branes and the structure of string theory. The billiard ball scenario was something of a side project, a way of sharpening intuitions about what closed time-like curves actually imply physically, not just logically. What it implied, he concluded, was that the physics near closed time-like curves is genuinely weird in ways that go beyond the familiar logical paradoxes. The paradoxes, it turns out, can be resolved, at least mathematically. Self-consistent solutions exist, the loop can close, but the resolution introduces its own strangeness, a loss of uniqueness, an indeterminacy, a situation where the initial conditions of a classical system do not determine a unique classical outcome. For some physicists, this is enough to make closed time-like curves physically suspect, even if they are not outright impossible. A universe in which classical determinism fails for macroscopic objects near certain topological features of space-time is a strange universe. Not an obviously wrong universe, but a strange one. And we are still not sure whether we live in it. The billiard ball is still rolling. The wormhole, if it exists, is still there. And the universe, if the self-consistency principle holds, has already calculated which of the infinitely many solutions will occur. We just do not know which one it picked, because from our current position outside the loop, all we can see is a ball rolling toward a hypothetical opening in space-time. And if the opening is real, the ball will do something. We will just have to watch. The Causal Loop. Somewhere in a city, a young musician sits in a small apartment, struggling with a composition. She has been working on it for months. She knows the feeling she wants it to have, the emotional shape of it, the way she wants it to move. But the specific notes, the specific structure, keep escaping her. She tries different approaches. Nothing lands the way she hears it in her head. Late one night, there is a knock at her door. An older version of herself is standing there. She knows immediately who it is. Same face, same hands, same small scar above the left eyebrow. The older version says nothing for a moment, then hands her a notebook, filled, cover to cover, with completed musical notation. The composition, finished. Every note, every dynamic marking, every structural decision resolved. The young musician takes the notebook. She studies it. Over the following weeks, she transcribes it, learns it, eventually records it. The recording becomes significant. Years later, she is older now. She is the one who travels back and hands the notebook to her younger self. Who wrote the music? Not the younger version. She received it fully formed. Not the older version either. She got it from the notebook she received when she was younger. The music exists, has always existed in the loop, complete and beautiful, and with no moment of original creation, no composer, no first draft, no process of working something out from nothing. The composition simply circulates through time, arriving perfectly formed at the moment of its own genesis, which was actually the moment of its reception from the future, which produced the future in which it was sent back. This is the causal loop, sometimes called the ontological paradox, and it is one of the most conceptually disorienting features of closed time-like curves. Not because it produces a contradiction, it does not. The timeline is perfectly consistent. Every event has a cause. Every effect produces the next cause. The loop is closed and coherent. What it lacks is an origin. There is no moment at which the information or the object in the loop was first created. No first cause. The music was never composed. It was only ever received, preserved, and transmitted, and that reception, preservation, and transmission was always going to produce the composition that the young musician received, which was always going to become the composition the older musician preserved and sent back. The causal loop is a structure in which causation is real and complete at every step, and yet the whole has no beginning. Philosophers have debated whether this is actually problematic. One position says that if every event in the loop has a sufficient cause, namely the preceding event in the loop, then the loop is causally complete, and there is nothing left to explain. Asking where the loop itself came from is like asking what is north of the North Pole. The question assumes a structure that the situation does not have. Another position says that something has gone deeply wrong. Real causation requires that effects be produced by their causes in a direction that corresponds to the flow of time. Information should increase entropy as it passes from the past to the future. A loop that circulates information without any source is not just strange, it is a violation of the thermodynamic arrow of time, which is the closest thing physics has to an explanation for why causation runs in one direction. Physicist Paul Davies has argued that the causal loop is not physically realizable for exactly this reason. Real physical information degrades over time. Copy something enough times and errors accumulate. Information sent through a wormhole would be subject to quantum noise, thermal fluctuations, and the ordinary processes of physical degradation that affect everything. Over many cycles of the loop, the information would drift and corrupt. It could not remain perfect indefinitely. If Davis is right, then perfect causal loops of the kind described in the musician thought experiment are not physically possible. Any actual loop would involve degrading information, accumulating errors across iterations, eventually diverging from whatever the original started as, until the loop either broke or collapsed into noise. But this resolution raises its own question. If the loop degrades, where did the high-quality version of the information come from in the first place? The degraded version could not have been the starting point because degradation only goes one way. You cannot degrade something and then have the degraded version be the source of the pristine original. The pristine original had to come from somewhere, which means even in the degrading loop scenario, there must have been a genuine origin at some point, a moment when the information was first created. But if the loop is a loop, there was no such moment. The loop has no beginning by construction, so either the loop is not real because it cannot maintain information integrity, or the loop is real and the degradation argument does not apply, or something else is happening that neither position fully captures. The causal loop also has implications for the concept of creativity and originality that go beyond physics. If information can circulate in a closed time loop without any source, then originality, in the sense of producing something genuinely new from nothing, might be a feature not of the information itself, but of the process by which it first entered a particular linear timeline. Suppose the music in the loop is objectively beautiful. Suppose it represents a genuine artistic achievement by any standard of evaluation that does not depend on knowing its origin. Is it still a work of art? Does artistic value require an author? Does the meaning of a piece of music change if you learn it was never actually composed by anyone, but simply arrived from the future already complete? Most people's intuition says yes, something changes. The discovery that no one wrote the music would feel like a loss even if the music itself was unchanged, which suggests that part of what we value in creative work is not just the product, but the process, the evidence of a mind working through a problem, making choices, constructing something from the raw material of possibilities. A causal loop removes the process. It delivers only the product, perfectly formed, eternally circulating, and the product might be indistinguishable from something created by the most careful and deliberate human effort, but it was not created. It was always just there, going around, Some people find this beautiful in its own way, a melody that has always existed, woven into the structure of space-time, waiting for the specific closed time-like curve that would allow it to be heard. Others find it hollow. A perfect thing with no origin is a thing with no meaning, because meaning requires the context of a mind that produced it. Whether that intuition about meaning is correct, or whether it is just an artifact of living in a linear time universe where everything has a beginning, is not something the causal loop paradox can settle. It can only put the question in its starkest possible form. If something has always existed, with no beginning, no creator, no moment of origination, what does it mean to call it real? And is it any less beautiful for having no author? There is a version of the causal loop that applies not to information or objects, but to people. And the personal version is considerably more unsettling than the musical one. Imagine a person whose existence is itself a causal loop. They travel back in time, fall in love, have a child. That child grows up, develops the specific combination of characteristics and experiences that eventually leads them to travel back in time, fall in love, and become their own parent. The person is their own ancestor. Their existence caused their own birth. Their birth produced the person who would eventually cause their own existence. This is sometimes called the ontological paradox of personal existence. And unlike the music example, you cannot separate the product from the process here. The person is not a piece of information circulating in a loop. They are a human being, with a life, with experiences, with a sense of identity that extends across time. And the foundation of that existence is a loop with no beginning. Where did the genetic material come from? From the parents. Where did the parents come from? From their own birth, which required the child to travel back and become the parent, which required the child to exist, which required the parent to exist, around and around, with no first person, no original human being, no moment when the loop was established from outside. Physicists working on closed time-like curves have confirmed that scenarios like this are at least mathematically self-consistent. The loop can close. The causal chain is complete at every step. No logical contradiction arises. And yet something feels deeply wrong in a way that is hard to fully articulate. Maybe what feels wrong is the violation of the intuition that existence requires an origin. That to be real, something must have come from somewhere, must have been produced by something that was not itself. The causal loop denies this. It says that existence can be self-founding, that a thing can cause itself, given the right temporal topology. And if a person can be self-founding, the causal loop says nothing prevents the same from being true of other things. Universes, perhaps, information structures, physical constants. The causal loop, taken seriously, opens a door to the possibility that some things are simply there, without having been put there, without having been produced by anything prior. Not because they are uncaused, but because the causal chain that produced them eventually loops back and includes them as their own cause. That is a very strange universe to live in. But it might be the one we actually inhabit. And if our universe has any closed time-like curves, anywhere in its structure, then somewhere in spacetime there are causal loops running quietly, things that have always existed without having been created, information circulating without a source, and possibly people who are their own ancestors, in ways that would make any family tree a closed ring rather than a branching structure. Most of us will never know if any of this applies to us specifically, but the logical possibility that it applies to something in the universe, that somewhere a perfect thing is circulating without origin, is already enough to make the concept of beginning feel less certain than it used to. When did things start? Did everything have a first cause, somewhere back at the beginning of time? Or are there pockets in the structure of reality where the question of first cause simply does not apply, where the loop just goes around, complete and originating and caused and causeless, all at once? One more thread to follow before leaving the causal loop. The loop, as a structure, implies something unusual about the relationship between past, present, and future within it. In ordinary linear time, the past is fixed, and the future is open. What has happened cannot be changed. What will happen has not yet been determined, at least not from any perspective that is local to the present moment. But inside a causal loop, this distinction does not work the same way. The past and the future are equally fixed, because the loop is closed and the whole thing has to be self-consistent. The musician receiving the notebook in the past is fixed by the future in which she sends it back. The future in which she sends it back is fixed by the past in which she received it. Neither is prior to the other. Neither is open in the way that the future ordinarily feels open. So from inside a causal loop, you might still experience the subjective sense of an open future. Your choices would still feel undetermined. The next moment would still feel like it could go multiple ways. And yet the entire trajectory of the loop is already fixed by the requirement of self-consistency, including every choice you will make, every action you will take, and the fact that you will eventually close the loop by doing whatever is needed to close it. This is the deepest version of the predestination that the causal loop implies, not predestination imposed by fate, or by a god, or by any external force, but predestination that emerges from the self-referential structure of a closed causal chain. The loop is the fate, and being inside it is indistinguishable from being free. You are making choices. The choices are real. The outcomes of those choices are also already determined. Both of these things are true at once, inside a closed, time-like curve, and there is no contradiction between them. Which is exactly what the most hardline determinists have always said about ordinary linear time, just without the exotic physics. Maybe the causal loop is just what determinism looks like when the universe is honest about it. The energy requirement paradox. Before you can worry about what happens when you arrive in the past, there is a more immediate problem. Getting there in the first place. Time travel, in any physically plausible version, requires moving through space-time in a direction that ordinary matter does not naturally go. Moving forward in time is something everything does, constantly, automatically, without any energy expenditure at all. You are traveling forward in time right now, at 1 second per second, doing nothing to make it happen. Backward time travel, or even moving forward at a dramatically accelerated rate while others age normally, requires doing something to space-time that it does not do on its own. And doing things to space-time costs energy. The question the energy requirement paradox asks is how much? And the answer, when you work through the physics seriously, is deeply uncomfortable. Start with the simplest case. Time dilation, the relativistic effect that causes moving clocks to tick more slowly than stationary ones, is real and confirmed. To experience time passing more slowly than someone who stays behind, you need to move very fast. How fast depends on how much time dilation you want. To age 1 year, while 10 years pass on Earth, you would need to travel at roughly 99.5% of the speed of light. Continuous travel at that speed requires continuous energy expenditure to maintain. And as you approach the speed of light, the energy required to go slightly faster increases without bound. At the speed of light itself, the energy required is infinite. You cannot reach it. You can only asymptotically approach it while spending more and more energy for smaller and smaller gains in speed. This puts a hard limit on how much time dilation you can achieve with a rocket. You can slow your personal clock relative to Earth's, but you cannot stop it entirely, and you cannot reverse it. Time dilation gets you to the future at an accelerated rate. It does not get you to the past at all. Going backward in time requires something more exotic than simply moving fast through space. The most physically motivated proposals involve wormholes, those hypothetical tunnels through space-time that might connect distant locations or different times. To create a wormhole large enough to pass through and stable enough to not immediately collapse would require something called exotic matter, a form of matter with negative energy density. Not just low energy density, negative, less than nothing. We have indirect evidence that something like exotic matter effects can occur in quantum field theory, in the Casimir effect, where the energy density between two closely spaced conducting plates is negative in a specific and measurable sense. But the scale of the Casimir effect is tiny. The exotic matter required to stabilize a traversable wormhole would need to be exotic at macroscopic scales, possibly at cosmological scales. And we have never observed anything like that, and have no mechanism for producing it. Some physicists estimate that creating a wormhole large enough to be useful as a time machine might require more exotic matter than the total energy content of a star, concentrated in a very specific geometric configuration, maintained against the tendency of the wormhole geometry to collapse. The engineering requirements are not merely beyond our current technology, they may be beyond anything physically achievable by any civilization at any stage of development. Stephen Hawking proposed a related argument, which he called the chronology protection conjecture. His suggestion was that the laws of physics conspire to prevent time travel from being achieved, not because any specific law prohibits it, but because the conditions required to create a time machine also create conditions that destroy it before it becomes operational. The argument goes roughly like this. To create a closed time-like curve, you need to warp space-time in a very specific way. But as you approach the conditions needed to create such a curve, quantum vacuum fluctuations in the energy of empty space build up at the boundary of the would-be time machine. These vacuum fluctuations become more and more intense as the moment of closed curve formation approaches. Eventually, they reach a density that damages or destroys the very structure that was going to create the time machine. Reality, in a sense, defends itself against having its past become accessible. Hawking worked out the mathematics of this for specific space-time geometries and found that the vacuum fluctuations always blow up at the critical moment. Not always explosively, not always dramatically, but always reaching a density that would prevent the formation of a time machine before the time machine could form. He was careful to note that his calculation depended on semi-classical approximations that break down before the full quantum gravity effects kick in, so the conjecture is not proven. It is a strong argument, but not a demonstration. If Hawking is right, then the universe has a built-in defense mechanism against time travel. The energy requirements for creating a time machine trigger a feedback process that destroys the time machine before it works. And this defense is not enforced by any specific law, it just emerges from the interaction of quantum field theory with curved space-time. That would be a remarkable fact about the universe. Not that time travel is forbidden by decree, but that it is self-preventing. That the attempt to create the conditions for time travel generates the very conditions that prevent time travel from occurring. A form of cosmic self-protection that operates through physics rather than through prohibition. There is a version of the energy requirement paradox that does not involve Hawking radiation or wormholes or exotic matter. It involves something simpler and in some ways more fundamental: thermodynamics. Time, in the thermodynamic view, has a direction because entropy increases. The second law of thermodynamics says that the total entropy of a closed system does not decrease over time. Things become more disordered. The past is different from the future because the past has lower entropy than the future. The arrow of time is the arrow of increasing entropy. Traveling backward in time would require moving in the direction of decreasing entropy, going from a high entropy state to a lower entropy state. And this is not just energetically expensive. According to the second law, it is thermodynamically forbidden for a closed system. You cannot spontaneously decrease the entropy of a closed system. It would require work. Specifically, it would require an amount of work proportional to the entropy decrease. How much entropy would you need to decrease to travel back in time by a meaningful amount? The entropy of the observable universe has increased enormously since the Big Bang, by amounts that are difficult to even express in familiar units. Reversing any significant fraction of that increase would require energy inputs that are physically meaningless to discuss. The thermodynamic argument does not prove that time travel is impossible in the way that a logical contradiction proves something is impossible. Thermodynamic laws are statistical rather than absolute at the level of individual particles. In principle, a sufficiently unlikely fluctuation could decrease entropy locally. The second law is not violated, just temporarily evaded in specific microscopic systems under specific conditions. But the scale of evasion required for macroscopic backward time travel is so far beyond any physically conceivable fluctuation that the thermodynamic barrier is, for all practical purposes, absolute. What all of these arguments share is a common structure. Time travel is not forbidden by any single specific law. It is prevented by the conjunction of multiple physical constraints, each of which individually might be circumventable, but which together build a barrier that becomes effectively absolute. Exotic matter problems, vacuum fluctuation feedback, thermodynamic entropy barriers, quantum gravitational effects at the critical boundary. Each argument has gaps and uncertainties, but they all point in the same direction. The universe appears to want very badly to keep its past inaccessible, not through any single lock, but through layers and layers of physical reality that all happen to prevent the same thing. which could be a coincidence, or it could be a deep feature of the structure of space-time that we are only beginning to understand. Hawking's chronology protection conjecture has a version that goes beyond the specific vacuum fluctuation argument. His broader claim was that it seems to be the case that the laws of physics conspire to prevent time travel from being achieved. The word conspire is interesting. It implies coordination without a coordinator. Multiple laws, multiple effects, multiple physical mechanisms, all working in the same direction without any single one of them being solely responsible. If the universe is conspiring to protect its own past, what is it protecting it from? The answer cannot be paradoxes, because paradoxes are logical problems and the universe does not reason. But the universe does compute, in the sense that its state at each moment is determined by its state at previous moments. And a universe that can be retroactively altered might be a universe that cannot stably compute anything. Maybe chronology protection is just stability. A universe that allows its past to be changed is a universe that can unravel. A universe that prevents its past from being changed is a universe that can persist. And persistence is a prerequisite for the kind of complexity that eventually produces physicists who notice that the universe seems to be protecting its own past. We are inside the system that is protecting itself. We can observe the protection from within. What we cannot fully see is whether the protection is a fundamental feature of space-time or a contingent fact that could, with enough energy and creativity, be overcome. And if it can be overcome, what then? There is one more angle to the energy requirement paradox that cuts closer to something personal. Even setting aside the exotic physics of wormholes and the thermodynamic barriers and the Hawking radiation feedback, there is a simpler version of the energy problem that operates at a more intuitive level. Consider what you are actually asking the universe to do when you request backward time travel. You are asking it to take a specific physical system, yourself, and move it to an earlier state of the universe. Not just to move you through space, to move you through a temporal coordinate in a direction that the universe ordinarily does not allow. To place you in a context where the causal history that led to you sitting in a time machine has not happened yet, where the time machine has not been built, where the knowledge that allowed the time machine to be built has not been developed, where you, the person who is about to arrive, have not been born. Moving you backward in time does not just move your mass, it moves your entire causal history. Every event that produced you, every particle interaction that led to your current configuration, every moment that made you the specific person you are rather than any of the other people you could have been. All of that history is encoded in you. And placing you in the past means placing that encoded history in a context where it has not yet happened. The energy required for this is not just the energy of moving mass. It is, in a sense, the energy of creating a causal gap, of inserting a causal chain into a position earlier than it belongs. And that kind of gap, that kind of causal anachronism, may not have any finite energy cost. It may simply be outside the set of physical transformations that the universe permits, not because of any single prohibition but because the structure of causality itself does not accommodate it. You are, in the end, a product of everything that happened before you. Moving you backward in time means moving the product to before the process. And the universe, organized as it is around causes preceding effects, may simply not have a mechanism for doing that. Not for lack of energy, but for lack of any transformation that produces the required result while remaining consistent with the causal structure that makes physical transformations possible in the first place. The energy requirement paradox points at something deeper than just needing a bigger engine. It points at the possibility that the kind of physical operation that backward time travel would require is not just expensive, but incoherent, not a transformation that physics forbids, but a transformation that physics cannot even formulate. And incoherent operations, unlike expensive ones, cannot be resolved by finding more power. They can only be resolved by rethinking what you are asking for. What would it mean to ask the universe for something it cannot formulate an answer to? And is the silence that follows a refusal, or just the absence of a question that was ever meaningful? The self-fulfilling prophecy. A woman wakes up one morning with a sense of dread she cannot explain. Something is going to go wrong today. She does not know what. She does not know why. But the feeling is specific and heavy and she cannot shake it. She moves through her day carefully. She avoids the things she normally does. She takes a different route. She declines an invitation. She is watchful in a way she would not normally be. And by the end of the day, exhausted from the vigilance and the anxiety, she makes a mistake she would not have made on a normal day. A small error in judgment, a lapse of attention born from hours of sustained tension. Something goes wrong. Was the sense of dread correct? Yes. Was it a prediction? Or did it produce what it predicted? Both. The self-fulfilling prophecy is one of the most well-documented phenomena in human psychology and sociology. The belief in an outcome changes behavior in ways that bring the outcome about. Not always. Not in every case, but often enough, and in enough different contexts, that it has been studied seriously for decades and applied across medicine, economics, education, and interpersonal relationships. In the context of time travel, the self-fulfilling prophecy takes on a harder edge, not just a belief that nudges behavior, but a direct encounter with the future that becomes causally constitutive of the future you encountered. Imagine a traveler who goes forward in time and sees a catastrophic war. They return to the present carrying a specific and detailed knowledge of what is coming. They try to warn people, governments, military leaders, ordinary citizens, but the way they describe the war, the specific details they provide about who will fight whom and why, becomes the information that shapes how the relevant parties understand their geopolitical situation. That understanding influences decisions. Those decisions set the conditions that lead to exactly the war the traveler described. The traveler did not observe a fixed future and fail to change it. The traveler observed a possible future and then, through the act of describing it, caused it. The prophecy was self-fulfilling not because of fate, but because information is causal. What you know changes what you do. What you do changes what happens. And if what you know came from the future, then the future is, in a very real sense, reaching backward through the transmission of information to cause itself. This is not the same as the Predestination Paradox, though they are related. In predestination, the traveler tries to prevent an outcome and ends up causing it through unintended consequences. In the self-fulfilling prophecy, the traveler may not be trying to prevent anything, they may simply be sharing what they saw. The prophecy is fulfilled not through ironic reversal, but through direct causal transmission. You describe a future. People believe you. They act on the belief. The action produces the future you described. The sociologist Robert Merton, who coined the term self-fulfilling prophecy in the 1940s, documented how this works in ordinary social systems without any time travel required. A bank is financially sound, but rumors spread that it is in trouble. Depositors, believing the rumors, withdraw their money. The withdrawals cause the bank to actually run out of liquid funds. The bank fails. The rumor that was false when it started becomes true because enough people acted on it. In Merton's example, the prophecy was false but became true. In the time travel version, the prophecy is true in the sense that the traveler genuinely saw the future. But it is true partly because the traveler saw it and returned to describe it, which contributed to causing it. The prophecy is accurate and self-causing simultaneously. What makes this particularly hard to think about is the question of what the future would have been if the traveler had not gone there. If the war was only made inevitable by the traveler's description of it, then there was a version of the future where the war did not happen, a version that was foreclosed by the act of observing the version where it did. The observation collapsed the possibility space. In quantum mechanics, observation does something like this. Before measurement, a quantum system exists in superposition, a range of possible states. Measurement forces it into one definite state. The other possible states do not become realized. The observation selects one outcome from among many. The self-fulfilling prophecy in time travel might work analogously. Before the traveler visits the future, multiple futures are possible. The act of visiting one and returning to describe it sends information back that influences the very processes that determine which future occurs. The traveler did not just observe the future, they selected it. And they did so not through any grand intervention, but through the ordinary, unavoidable fact that carrying information back in time means releasing that information into the causal chain that produces the future the information came from. This creates an uncomfortable implication about the ethics of looking at the future. If seeing a future contributes to causing it, then every act of temporal observation carries moral weight. You are not a neutral witness. You are a participant. What you choose to look at, and whether you choose to return and describe what you saw, shapes what actually happens. And if you return and describe what you saw selectively, emphasizing some details and omitting others, you are actively shaping the causal chain that produces the future. You are editing reality not by intervening in the past, but by controlling the information flow from the future, which is a form of power that the self-fulfilling prophecy framework makes visible. Oracles in ancient mythology were understood to have exactly this kind of power, and they were depicted as using it carefully, sometimes deliberately obscuring their prophecies to prevent exactly this kind of direct causal interference. The Delphic oracle's famous ambiguity might be read not as dishonesty but as caution. A prophecy stated too clearly becomes a cause. A prophecy stated ambiguously becomes a warning that the recipient has to interpret, which distributes the causal responsibility more broadly and reduces the oracle's direct contribution to the outcome. A time traveler with foreknowledge faces the same problem. Every word they say about the future is a causal intervention. Every detail they share nudges the causal chain in specific directions. Every silence is also a choice, a decision not to intervene that shapes the future by absence rather than by presence. There is no neutral position. Coming back from the future with knowledge means being in the causal chain regardless of what you do with what you know. The self-fulfilling prophecy is not a trap you can avoid by being careful with your words. It is the basic structure of the situation. Information from the future influences the present that produces the future. Anywhere information flows backward in time, causality bends to accommodate it. And the bending is not random. It is specifically shaped by the content of the information, which means the future is not just influencing the present, it is writing itself. That is a strange universe to live in. A universe where the future can reach backward through information to participate in its own creation. Where what will happen can be part of the cause of what will happen. Where prophecy is not a prediction of an independent future, but a contribution to its construction. We do not need time travel for this to be at least partially true. Every prediction shapes what it predicts when the people being predicted know about the prediction and act on it. The self-fulfilling prophecy is already here, operating in economics and politics and medicine and everywhere else that forecasts influence behavior. Time travel would just make the causal loop complete and explicit rather than partial and obscured. And if the causal loop of self-fulfilling prophecy is already here, in ordinary life, then the future is already, in a modest and partial and thoroughly terrestrial way, helping to write itself. How much of what you believe will happen to you are you in the process of causing to happen? And if you could trace the causal chain backward from some outcome you expect, would you find yourself at the beginning of it, or somewhere in the middle, or would you find that the beginning is somewhere in a future you have not reached yet? There is a personal version of the self-fulfilling prophecy that operates below the level of grand historical events and is much harder to detect because of how close it is to ordinary experience. You form a belief about yourself. Maybe that you are not good at something. Maybe that a particular relationship will not work out. Maybe that you will fail at a specific kind of endeavor. The belief is not baseless. It emerged from real experiences, real evidence, real patterns you have observed in your own behavior. It feels like an accurate read on reality, rather than a prediction. But the belief shapes how you approach the relevant situations. You invest less. You hold something in reserve. You prepare for failure in ways that slightly ensure it. You avoid the situations where you would have to test the belief directly, which prevents you from accumulating evidence that might revise it. Over time, the outcomes that follow are consistent with the belief, which feels like confirmation, which strengthens the belief, which shapes the next round of situations the same way. The belief does not prove itself false because it keeps being fulfilled, but it is being fulfilled partly because you hold it. The causation is circular. The belief produces evidence that supports the belief, that produces behavior that generates the evidence. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy at the level of personal psychology, and it does not require any special mechanism. Just the ordinary fact that beliefs shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes, and outcomes shape beliefs. The loop closes not through time travel, but through the feedback structure of a self-aware system that learns from its own history. What would it take to interrupt the loop? Not just to know that it is running, because knowing does not automatically break it. You can be fully aware that your beliefs are self-fulfilling and still find them self-fulfilling because the awareness itself is processed through the same belief-shaped interpretive framework that is producing the loop in the first place. Breaking a self-fulfilling prophecy requires acting against the belief before the evidence comes in, taking the risk that the belief is wrong before you have any proof that it is, which is genuinely hard because it means acting on something other than your best current read on the situation, which is exactly what the belief is. The temporal version, with a time traveler seeing a war and returning to describe it, is just the external version of this. The prophecy fulfills itself because the information flows in the wrong direction, backward from effect to cause. The personal version fulfills itself because the belief flows in the wrong direction too, backward from expected outcome to the behavior that produces the outcome that confirms the expectation. Both are loops, both are real, and both are harder to escape from the inside than they look from the outside. What belief about your own future are you currently in the process of fulfilling? And how would you know if you were? One more layer before moving on. The self-fulfilling prophecy assumes that the person who receives the prophecy has some agency over whether it is fulfilled, that their belief and behavior are the mechanisms through which the prophecy becomes true. This means the prophecy is not inevitable in any absolute sense. It becomes true because of what the person does with the information. Change the person's response to the information, and you change whether the prophecy is fulfilled. But time travel introduces a version where this agency might be illusory. If the traveler returns from the future having observed an event that already occurred in the timeline they visited, then that event is, in some sense, fixed. The traveler did not observe a possible future. They observed the actual future, the one that is going to happen because it already happened in the timeline the traveler came from. Whether the traveler's description of it contributes causally to making it happen or whether it was going to happen regardless is then a question about the causal structure of the timeline. In a single self-consistent timeline, the traveler's return and description were always part of the causal chain that led to the event. The agency was real, but it was always going to be exercised in exactly the way it was. The self-fulfilling prophecy was always going to fulfill itself, because the traveler's response to the information was always going to be exactly what it was, because the traveler is the person they are. In a branching timeline model, things are different. The traveler comes from one branch and returns to the present of that branch with information about one possible future. Whether that future is realized depends on what happens next, including what the traveler does with the information. Genuine agency is possible. The prophecy might be self-fulfilling or self-defeating depending on choices that are not yet determined. The self-fulfilling prophecy in time travel is, at root, a question about which model of time is correct. Are we in a single timeline where everything that will happen was always going to happen? Or are we in a branching structure where the future is genuinely open and prophecies are just very well-informed guesses that can be fulfilled or confounded by the choices of aware agents? We do not know which one we are in. And the self-fulfilling nature of prophecy, in both ordinary life and in time travel scenarios, works the same way in either case. The loop closes. The prediction comes true. The question of whether it had to is one that the fulfilled prophecy, by itself, cannot answer. The Bootstrap Paradox. There is a book that does not have an author, not in the sense that the author is unknown or that the authorship is disputed, but in the more fundamental sense that the book was never written by anyone. No one sat down and worked out the ideas, wrestled with the structure, made the choices about what to include and what to leave out, struggled with the phrasing of difficult sections, or produced a first draft that was later revised. The book simply exists, in circulation, having arrived from a future where it was already in circulation. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, and it is perhaps the most elegant of all the time travel paradoxes, because it does not require contradiction. Nothing breaks, nothing is impossible. The timeline remains perfectly consistent from every angle you examine it, and yet something is profoundly missing. The scenario is easy to construct in its basic form. You find a book, you read it. Years later, you build a time machine. You take the book back to a time before it existed, hand it to a publisher, and watch it enter the historical record. The publisher distributes it. Readers read it. Libraries archive it. Eventually, a copy reaches you. in the time before you traveled back, at the moment you first found it and read it. The causal chain is complete. Every event has a cause. The timeline is self-consistent. But where did the ideas in the book come from? Nobody generated them through the ordinary process of thinking and discovering and creating. They circulated. They were handed from future to past, transcribed, published, distributed, read, and then handed from future to past again. The loop has been running, in principle, forever. There is no first iteration where someone actually wrote the book. There is only the eternal circulation of a book that, in a meaningful sense, was never written. This is what philosophers call an uncaused cause, or more precisely, a causally self-contained loop with no external origin. The book causes its own existence by circulating through time in a way that ensures it is always already present at any point in the loop. The information in the book did not come from anywhere. It has always existed inside the closed temporal structure of the loop, named for the old expression about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, which describes a physical impossibility because you cannot lift yourself using only your own body weight. The Bootstrap Paradox in time travel describes a logical structure that is not impossible but is deeply strange. You can, apparently, in a universe that permits closed time-like curves, pull information up by its own bootstraps. Create knowledge from nothing by circulating it in a loop that has no beginning. One of the first questions people ask when they hear this is whether the information in the loop degrades over time. If you photocopy a page, and then photocopy the photocopy, and then photocopy that, each generation introduces small errors. The 100th generation is noticeably worse than the first. Does the bootstrapped information degrade the same way, getting a little worse with each iteration of the loop, until it eventually becomes too corrupted to be useful? In ordinary physical terms, yes, degradation is a real concern. Every physical encoding of information is subject to noise, to thermal fluctuations, to the quantum mechanical uncertainty that affects all physical systems at the microscopic level. Perfect copying is impossible, as the quantum no-cloning theorem establishes, so any physical instantiation of the Bootstrap Paradox would involve some degree of degradation. But the paradox, in its pure logical form, does not depend on physical encoding. It depends on the structure of the causal loop. If the causal loop is truly closed, then the information at each point in the loop is exactly the information required to produce the next point in the loop, which means the information is self-sustaining in a way that does not involve copying errors. The loop selects for consistency. Any degradation that accumulated would eventually produce an inconsistency, and the Novikov self-consistency principle would prevent that outcome from being realized. The loop would only work for information that can sustain itself indefinitely without degradation. This is a remarkably strict constraint. In practice, it might rule out most real information from being bootstrapped. Only information that can be perfectly reproduced at every step of the loop would qualify, which raises the question of what kind of information that could possibly be. Mathematical truths are one candidate. A mathematical theorem does not degrade when copied. The Pythagorean theorem is the same in every copy of every book that contains it. If a time traveler brought a book of mathematics back in time, and the book was copied and recopied, and eventually a copy reached the traveler before they departed, the mathematical content would be preserved without degradation at every step. A bootstrapped book of mathematics could in principle maintain its integrity around the loop indefinitely. This would be a remarkable thing. Mathematical knowledge that has always existed, that was discovered by no one, that circulates eternally in a closed temporal loop, that humanity simply encounters rather than develops. The theorems would be real, they would be true, they would be useful, but they would have no history of discovery, no mathematician who first proved them, no moment of breakthrough, no process of working from intuition to conjecture to proof. Just the eternal presence of results that came from nowhere and are going nowhere, existing in a loop that has no beginning and no end. That is strange enough, but consider a more personal version. What if the information in the loop is not mathematical, but autobiographical? Not theorems, but memories. A person writes down their memories, travels back in time, gives the document to their younger self. The younger self reads it, lives the experiences described, and later writes them down again and travels back to give them to their younger self. The memories are real. They correspond to events that actually happened. but the specific form in which they are encoded, the specific words, the specific framing, the specific emphasis, came from nowhere. They were not chosen by anyone making decisions about how to tell their own story. They were received and then reproduced. In this version of the Bootstrap Paradox, the person's self-understanding, the narrative they used to make sense of their own life, was not constructed by them through reflection. It was given to them from the future, from a version of themselves who had already received it and passed it on. The self-narrative circulates in a loop that has no origin, and everything the person understands about who they are and how they came to be that way is the product of a closed temporal loop that they are simply a node of, not the author of. That is perhaps the most disorienting version of the Bootstrap Paradox, not the book with no writer, but the person with no genuine self-authorship, the individual who believes they understand themselves because they have reflected carefully on their own experience, but who is actually just transmitting a self-understanding that arrived from a future version of themselves, who was also transmitting it without originating it. Most self-understanding is constructed through an iterative process. You have experiences, you interpret them. The interpretations shape how you approach future experiences. The new experiences modify the interpretations. Over time, through many cycles of experience and reflection, a self-understanding develops that is genuinely yours because you built it, piece by piece, from the actual encounters of your actual life. But if the self-understanding was bootstrapped, there is no such process. The final product arrived before the experiences. The interpretation preceded the events it interpreted. The self-understanding was given to you whole, already assembled, and you then lived your life in a way that confirmed it because you were working from it all along. You would not be able to tell the difference from the inside. The self-understanding would feel like yours because it corresponds to your experiences, because it makes sense of your life, because it captures something true about who you are. But its origin would not be in your experience. It would be in a loop that predates you and will continue after you, of which you are one point among many. The Bootstrap Paradox, taken seriously, raises the question of whether any of our most fundamental frameworks for understanding ourselves and the world could have the same structure, not the trivial sense in which everything is causally connected to everything else, but the specific sense in which some piece of knowledge or self-understanding might have no origin in the genuine sense, no moment when someone first worked it out from first principles, but only an eternal circulation of something that has always been present. Because it is always arriving from the future, we cannot know from inside the loop whether we are in one. The knowledge that circulates without origin looks exactly like the knowledge that was painfully developed through genuine intellectual labor. The self-understanding that came from nowhere looks exactly like the self-understanding that was built through years of honest reflection. The loop is invisible from the inside because the inside is the loop. What is it that you most confidently know about yourself? And where precisely did that knowledge come from? Can you trace it back to specific experiences and specific moments of insight? Or does the tracing become unclear at some point, leading you to sources that themselves have no clear origin? And if it does, is that a sign of ordinary memory's fallibility, or something stranger? There is a physics version of the Bootstrap Paradox that gets less attention than the philosophical one, but is in some ways more troubling. Some cosmological models suggest that the universe itself might be self-bootstrapping, not just the information in the universe, but the physical laws that govern the universe might have emerged from a kind of causal loop in which the laws selected themselves. The argument goes roughly like this. The physical constants and laws of our universe appear to be precisely tuned for the existence of complexity. If they were slightly different, atoms would not form, stars would not ignite, chemistry would not produce molecules capable of self-replication. The universe is, in a very specific sense, the kind of universe that can produce observers who notice that the universe is the kind of universe that can produce observers. One explanation for this is the anthropic principle. We observe the laws we observe because in a universe with different laws, we would not be here to observe anything. But the anthropic principle requires either an enormous ensemble of universes with different laws, from which ours was selected by the fact of our existence, or it requires the laws to have been set deliberately. A third option is that the laws bootstrap themselves. In some models, the early universe went through a phase in which physical laws were not yet settled, in which the constants were not yet fixed. As the universe evolved, certain configurations of constants were selected because they were the ones that produced the kind of complexity that could influence, through quantum effects or through some deeper mechanism, the probability of those constants persisting. The universe, in this scenario, contributed to selecting its own laws. The laws that exist are the ones that were good at making themselves persist. And the whole process has the structure of a bootstrap loop, not a temporal loop in the time travel sense, but a causal loop in which the laws participated in causing themselves to be the laws. This is speculative physics, not established science, but it shows that the Bootstrap Paradox is not just a curiosity about time travel. It is a structure that appears in serious thinking about the deepest questions in cosmology. How the universe came to have the specific laws it has, whether those laws had to be what they are or could have been otherwise, whether there is a sense in which the universe chose itself, and if the universe is self-bootstrapped in this sense, then the knowledge you use to think about the universe is also, in some recursive way, the product of a universe that selected itself to produce exactly the kind of complexity that generates exactly this kind of knowledge. Loops all the way down. Some of them visible, most of them not. The Bootstrap Paradox is the universe's version of a thing that exists without having been made. And the unsettling possibility it raises is not just that such things can exist in time travel scenarios, but that such things might already exist all around you, and that the knowledge you would use to identify them might itself be one of them. One final thing about the Bootstrap Paradox that is worth sitting with before leaving it. The paradox is usually presented as a problem, something that needs to be resolved or explained away, but it might be worth asking whether it is actually a problem or whether it is simply a feature of a universe that permits closed time-like curves. In ordinary linear time, the assumption that everything has an origin is so deeply built into how we think that it feels like a logical necessity rather than a contingent feature of our situation. Things come from somewhere. Ideas are created by minds. Objects are built from materials. Information is generated by processes. The chain of causes always has a beginning somewhere, even if the beginning is the Big Bang, which then raises its own questions about what caused the Big Bang. But if the universe permits closed time-like curves, this assumption breaks down. Some things do not come from anywhere. Some things exist in loops with no beginning. And that is not a contradiction. It is not a paradox in the strict logical sense. It is just a different kind of causal structure from the one we are used to. A universe with closed time-like curves is a universe in which the question, where did this come from, does not always have a meaningful answer. For some things the honest answer is nowhere. It has always existed in the loop. Its existence is its own cause. That is a strange universe. But strangeness is not impossibility, and if the physics permits it, then perhaps some small part of our discomfort with the Bootstrap Paradox is not pointing at a real problem in the physics, but at the limits of intuitions built for a simpler kind of universe than the one we might actually inhabit. What would you have to give up to make peace with the idea that some things have no origin? And what would remain, once you gave it up, that you could still call understanding? The meeting yourself paradox. You step out of your time machine, and there you are, standing 20 feet away, looking at you with an expression that is somewhere between recognition and alarm. Same face. Same posture, same slight habit of holding your right shoulder slightly higher than your left when you are uncertain about something. The other version of you is doing it right now. So are you. Meeting yourself is one of the most immediately disorienting scenarios in time travel thinking, not because it creates a logical contradiction, but because it creates a practical situation that has no precedent in ordinary experience, and that is deeply resistant to intuitive navigation. Start with the simplest version. You travel back to meet your past self. You know who this person is more completely than you have ever known any other person. You were this person. You have access to memories of being this person that are more detailed and more accurate than any memories you have of anyone else. You know what they are thinking right now, approximately, because you remember what you were thinking at this moment in your life. You know what they are afraid of. You know what they want. You know what they are going to do next, or at least what you did next, back when you were them. But do you actually know this person? The past self, standing in front of you, is not a memory. They are a physical presence with an independent inner life. They are processing the encounter in real time in ways that your memory of being them cannot fully capture, because you do not have memories of meeting your future self at this point in your life, unless this moment creates those memories, which it will, which means the current version of you, who is standing in the past, does not have memories of this encounter, because this encounter is what creates those memories. The situation is already strange before you have exchanged a single word. Now add the question of what you would say. You know something this person does not. You know how their life unfolds from this point. You know their failures and their regrets. You know the decisions they will make that they will later wish they had made differently. You know the people they will lose and the opportunities they will miss and the things they will spend years recovering from. Do you tell them? The obvious instinct is yes, of course, you would want to know. This person is you. Helping them is helping yourself. The information you could provide would allow them to avoid genuine suffering. Why would you withhold it? But consider what telling them actually does. Every piece of information you give them changes their decision space. If you tell them not to take a certain job, they do not take it. But the experiences they would have had at that job, the people they would have met there, the skills they would have developed, the ways they would have changed through those experiences, all of that does not happen. They become a different person than the person you were. The divergence between your paths begins immediately, and the person you are, the person who traveled back, is the product of taking the job, going through the experiences, meeting the people, developing the skills, changing in those particular ways. You became who you are, partly through things that will now not happen to the person you used to be. The version of you going forward will become someone else, not worse, necessarily, but different, which raises the question of whether this matters. If the past version of you becomes a different person through the encounter, are they still you? Or does the act of meeting yourself create a divergence that produces two distinct individuals, where before there was one continuous person moving through time? The philosopher Derek Parfit spent considerable energy on questions like this, though not specifically about time travel. His conclusion was that personal identity over time is not what matters. What matters is psychological continuity, the overlapping chain of memories and dispositions and character traits that connect earlier and later versions of a person. By this standard, the past you and the future you are the same person as long as there is a continuous causal chain of the right kind connecting them. But meeting yourself in a time travel scenario disrupts this causal chain in a specific way. The past you now has experiences, the encounter itself, that the future you does not have memories of experiencing, because the future you was not present for this version of the encounter. They were present for a different version, the one in their own past, which was the moment they remembered being when they were the past self. If you do not remember being the past self during this encounter, and the past self is not yet the future self and may never become them, depending on what information you share, then the continuity between the two of you is partial and contested in ways that Parfit's framework struggles to handle cleanly. Some physicists and philosophers argue that the meeting yourself scenario is only coherent in a branching timeline model. You cannot meet your past self in a single consistent timeline because there would then be two versions of you existing simultaneously in that timeline, which creates mass and causality problems. But in a branching model, you can travel back to a point before the branch, meet the version of yourself that existed before the divergence, and the encounter itself creates the branch. The past you continues forward in the original branch, having been visited. The future you returns to a different branch, having done the visiting. No single continuous person occupies both roles simultaneously in the same timeline. This resolution preserves logical consistency, but loses something personal. The past you that you met is not your past self anymore. They are the past self of a different version of you, one who will not remember this encounter as something that happened to them because it happened to a different version of them. The encounter is real, but the connection it creates is between two people from different branches, not between the same person at different times. Which might be true of all meetings between people who share a past and then diverged. You meet an old friend you have not seen in years. The person you knew has changed. The person they knew has changed. You share a history, but you are both, in some meaningful sense, different people from the ones who were friends. Meeting your time-traveling self is just a more extreme and temporally explicit version of the ordinary experience of confronting the gap between who you were and who you have become. The knowledge problem in the meeting yourself scenario cuts in both directions. The future version of you knows things the past version does not, but the past version also knows things the future version has forgotten. The specific texture of experience from this period in life, the particular quality of not yet knowing what comes next, the openness of a future that has not yet closed into a definite past, all of this is vivid to the past self and inaccessible to the future one. Memory compresses and distorts. You remember the significant things, the turning points, the moments of acute feeling. What you lose is the ambient experience, the way ordinary days felt from the inside, the specific quality of attention you brought to daily life before certain things became routine or certain concerns became dominant. The past self has all of this, and the future self has lost most of it. So the knowledge exchange in a meeting yourself scenario might not be as asymmetric as it initially appears. The future self carries specific information about what comes next. The past self carries a quality of present experience that the future self cannot recover. Both have something the other lacks. The meeting would be an exchange rather than simply a briefing from authority to subject. What would you actually want to know from a future version of yourself? And what would you be afraid to hear? Would you want them to tell you what goes wrong, or only what to do about it? Would you want to know who you become, or only whether you become someone you can respect? And if you met your past self right now, carrying everything you know about the years between, what is the first thing you would say? Not the most useful thing, the first, the thing that would come out before you had time to decide what the right thing was. That first thing might be more honest than anything you would arrive at through deliberation, and honesty in a meeting between past and future selves might be the only thing that would make the encounter worth having. What you choose to say and what you choose to withhold would reveal something about what you think the purpose of living through difficult experiences actually is. Whether you think knowledge of outcomes would have helped, or whether the not knowing was itself part of what the experience was for. Whether you believe that suffering with full foreknowledge is better or worse than suffering in ignorance. Whether you think your past self deserved to know what was coming. And buried in all of that is a question about what you think your life has been for. Whether it has been a process of discovering something through experience that could have been given to you more efficiently in advance, or whether the discovering was the point and giving the answer without the journey would have given you nothing of what the journey actually provided. Meeting yourself is the only scenario in which you could test this directly. The past self is available. The conversation is possible. You can choose what to say and watch what happens. What would you choose? And would you be able to live with that choice afterward? There is a version of the meeting yourself paradox that does not involve two physical people in the same place, but is in some ways more immediate. Every time you return to a significant location from your past, you are, in a limited sense, meeting a version of yourself that no longer exists. The house you grew up in, the school where specific things happened, the neighborhood where you spent years that shaped who you became. When you go back, the physical space is still there, changed but recognizable. And you bring with you the current version of yourself, the one who has lived through everything since, the one who carries a different relationship to that space than the person who originally inhabited it. You are not meeting your past self in any literal sense, but you are confronting the gap between who you were in that space and who you are now. And the confrontation is often more disorienting than people expect, because the space carries an emotional record of the person you were in it, a kind of distributed memory encoded in the physical environment, and encountering that memory while inhabiting the present self creates a strange doubled consciousness. The meeting yourself paradox, in this more everyday version, is not a logical problem. It is a phenomenological one. The experience of being two temporal versions of yourself simultaneously, in spirit if not in body, in a place that was formed by your earlier self and is now being experienced by your later one. And unlike the time travel version, this meeting is always available. Every significant place from your past is a version of the meeting yourself scenario that does not require any exotic physics. Just the ordinary fact of having a past and being able to return to the places where it lived. Whether returning is helpful depends on what you are looking for. Some people find it clarifying. The past becomes more solid, more defined, when you can stand in the actual space where it happened. Others find it blurring. The person they were and the person they are merge uncomfortably, neither quite separate enough to be seen clearly. The meeting yourself paradox, at every scale, is ultimately about the relationship between continuity and change. Whether the person you were and the person you are constitute a single continuous thing, or whether time produces a series of successively different people who share a history and a body. Physics and philosophy do not fully agree on the answer. Your experience of being you probably feels continuous, but you cannot verify from the inside whether that feeling accurately represents a metaphysical fact or is simply the only way a temporally extended process can feel to itself. Meeting yourself, in any form, is the closest you can get to checking. There is one more dimension to the meeting yourself scenario that the time travel framing makes unusually visible. In ordinary life, you interact with other people through a combination of what you know about them and what you observe in real time. The two sources of information are complementary. What you know provides context. What you observe provides currency. Together they produce a reasonably rich model of the person in front of you. When you meet yourself, the two sources of information are maximally mismatched. What you know is everything you have ever known about this person, including memories and inner states that no one else has access to. What you observe is a person in a specific moment of their life, reacting to an extraordinary situation, displaying whatever psychological responses the situation produces. The known and the observed are not just complementary. They are in active tension. You know this person from the inside, intimately and across time. You observe them from the outside, in real time, as they respond to something they have never faced before. And the person you observe may not match the person you know, because the situation is unprecedented, and unprecedented situations bring out aspects of a person that their ordinary life never requires. Your past self, faced with you, will react in ways that may surprise you, ways that tell you something about who you were that your memory of being them did not capture. Because memory edits, memory selects, memory preserves the version of the past that fits the story of the present. The actual person from your past, standing in front of you in real time, is not the edited memory version. They are the unedited original, responding spontaneously to an encounter you are both experiencing for the first time, even though you are both the same person. And in that gap, between the memory you carry of who you were and the person your past self actually turns out to be in this moment, there is something worth looking at carefully. Because whatever is in that gap is something you edited out, something that did not make it into the version of your own history that you carry, something real that you chose, consciously or not to keep. What would it mean to meet the version of yourself that you forgot? And would you recognize it when you did? Newcomb's Paradox. There is a being in this thought experiment that knows you, not in the way a close friend knows you through years of observation and conversation, in a more complete and unsettling way. This being has studied your decision-making processes with perfect accuracy. It has observed every choice you have ever made, analyzed the underlying patterns, and developed a model of your psychology so precise that it can predict, with perfect reliability, what you will choose in any given situation before you choose it. Now it presents you with a game. On a table in front of you are two boxes. Box A is transparent, and you can see that it contains $1,000. Box B is opaque. You cannot see what is inside it. You are given two options. You can take only Box B, or you can take both boxes. Here is what you are told about Box B. The being has already made its prediction about what you will do. If it predicted that you would take only Box B, it placed $1 million inside Box B before the game began. If it predicted that you would take both boxes, it left Box B empty. The prediction was made before you entered the room. The contents of the boxes are already fixed. Whatever is in Box B is in Box B. Nothing you do now can change what the being put inside it. What do you choose? This is Newcomb's Paradox, first described by physicist William Newcomb and brought to wide philosophical attention by Robert Nozick in 1969. It has been generating disagreement among philosophers, economists, and decision theorists ever since, and the disagreement is not superficial. Smart people who have thought carefully about this problem for decades do not agree on the answer. Here is the case for taking both boxes. Whatever is in box B is already in box B. Either it contains $1 million or it does not. Nothing you do changes that. The being made its prediction, filled the box or did not, and left the room. You are looking at two boxes with fixed contents. Taking both boxes guarantees you get at least $1,000 more than taking only box B. If box B is full, you get $1 million and $1,000 instead of just $1 million. If box B is empty, you get $1,000 instead of nothing. Either way, taking both boxes is better. This reasoning, called the dominance principle, is a cornerstone of rational decision theory. You choose the option that is better regardless of what the other relevant factor turns out to be. Here is the case for taking only box B. The being has a perfect prediction record. Everyone who has played this game before and taken both boxes found box B empty and walked away with only $1,000. Everyone who has taken only box B found $1 million inside. The empirical record is unambiguous. Taking only box B is, in the actual history of the game, the strategy that leads to wealth. Taking both boxes is the strategy that leads to poverty. If you want to be rich, take only box B. Both arguments are internally coherent. Both appeal to genuinely important principles of decision-making, and they lead to opposite conclusions. The one-boxer position is sometimes called evidential decision theory. On this view, what matters is the correlation between your action and the outcome. Taking only box B is strongly correlated with finding $1 million inside. Therefore, you should take only box B, even though the contents of the box are already fixed. The two-boxer position is called causal decision theory. On this view, what matters is the causal relationship between your action and the outcome. Your action now cannot causally affect what the being put in the box before you arrived. Therefore, you should take both boxes, because that is causally dominant. The reason the paradox is a paradox is that both of these decision theories are, in most situations, identical in their prescriptions. For most decisions, what is correlated with good outcomes is also what causally produces good outcomes. The divergence only becomes apparent in unusual cases where correlation and causation come apart, and Newcomb's problem is specifically engineered to create exactly that divergence. Now think about how this connects to time travel. A perfectly accurate predictor of human behavior is, in a temporal sense, essentially a being that knows your future. Whether the being acquired its knowledge by predicting forward from a complete model of your psychology, or by actually observing your future through some form of temporal access, the practical situation is the same. The being knows what you will do before you do it. The game is set up based on that knowledge, and you, acting in the present, are interacting with consequences that have already been determined by knowledge of your future choice. This is exactly the structure of many time travel scenarios. An entity with access to your future acts in your present based on that access. Your present choices interact with consequences that have already been fixed by future knowledge. The question of whether to take one box or two is the question of whether to cooperate with a system that claims to know your future or to act as if the future is genuinely open. In a time travel universe where the future is genuinely accessible to some beings, Newcomb's paradox is not a hypothetical. It is the structure of every interaction between a future-knowing entity and a present-acting individual. Every time a time traveler sets up conditions in the past based on knowledge of what the past person will do, they are creating a Newcomb situation. The past person's choices interact with consequences already fixed by knowledge of those choices, and the past person has to decide, am I the kind of person whose choices are already known, or am I the kind of person whose choices are genuinely open? Am I in a Newcomb game, or am I in an ordinary causal decision problem? The answer matters enormously. If you are in a Newcomb game with a perfect predictor, one boxing is empirically the winning strategy. If you are in an ordinary causal decision problem, two boxing is the dominant strategy. And the two situations look identical from the inside. You are facing boxes with fixed contents, making a choice that cannot causally alter those contents, but operating in a context where your choice was predicted with perfect accuracy by whoever filled the boxes. The philosophical significance of Newcomb's paradox goes beyond game theory. At its core, it is a question about the relationship between free will and foreknowledge. If someone knows what you will choose before you choose it, in what sense are you choosing? You feel as though you are deciding. The experience of deliberation is present. The sense of weighing options is real. but the outcome was already known. The box was filled or not before you arrived. Compatibilists about free will would say this is fine. Free will does not require that your choices be unpredictable. It only requires that they flow from your own reasoning and desires without external compulsion. The being's prediction is accurate because your choices are reliable expressions of your character, and reliable character is not the same as unfree character. Your choice is free and predicted simultaneously. Hard incompatibilists would say this is not fine. If your choice was already known with certainty before you made it, the deliberation you experience is epiphenomenal. It is not causing the choice. It is accompanying a process whose outcome was already determined. The choosing is real as an experience but not real as a causal factor in what actually happens. Newcomb's paradox does not settle this debate, but it does make it concrete in a way that abstract arguments about determinism rarely achieve. It takes the question of foreknowledge and free will and turns it into a practical decision with financial stakes, and then shows that the two dominant frameworks for rational decision-making give opposite answers. If you are a rational agent in a Newcomb situation, which kind of rational are you? The kind that follows causal dominance and takes both boxes, confident that the contents are fixed and your choice has no causal power over them, or the kind that follows evidential correlation and takes only box B, trusting that the correlation between your choice and the outcome is real enough to act on, even without a direct causal mechanism. Both kinds of rationality have serious philosophical defenders, both have serious objections, and the practical consequences of choosing between them, in a world where Newcomb games might actually exist and where time travel might create the conditions for perfect predictors, are not trivial. The paradox has a version that applies to everyday life without any exotic physics. Every time you make a decision based on what you think the kind of person you are would do, rather than on a pure calculation of causal consequences, you are reasoning like a one-boxer. You are acting on the correlation between your character and your outcomes, rather than on the immediate causal impact of your action. Integrity, in this sense, is one-boxing. The two-boxer says, the consequences of my past reputation are already fixed. Nothing I do now changes them. I should do whatever is locally optimal regardless of what it does to my character or reputation, because character and reputation are effects of past actions, and my current action cannot causally alter those past actions. The one-boxer says, my current action expresses and constitutes my character. What I do now is evidence of who I am, and who I am determines outcomes across many situations and many timescales. Acting as if the consequences are already fixed misses the fact that the consequences were fixed based on a prediction of what I would do, and doing the wrong thing now updates that prediction for all future situations. Living with integrity is, in this framing, just consistently one-boxing across a lifetime of Newcomb games, and the two-boxer who says that the past is fixed and only immediate causal consequences matter is someone who has opted out of the accountability structure that makes trust and reputation and character meaningful. Newcomb's paradox, which started as a puzzle about boxes and money, ends up being a puzzle about what it means to be the kind of person whose choices can be predicted, and whether being that kind of person is a limitation or a foundation. What kind of person are you? Not in the sense of what you value or what you aspire to, but in the deeper sense of what a perfect predictor would put in box B before you arrived. And do you know, there is a time travel version of Newcomb's paradox that is worth constructing explicitly because it reveals something about the relationship between temporal knowledge and agency that the original formulation only hints at. Imagine a being that does not predict your future choices by modeling your psychology. Instead, it literally travels to your future, observes what you choose, and then returns to the present to fill the box accordingly. Not prediction, observation. The being has direct evidence of what you choose because it was there when you chose it. Now you face the boxes. You know the being has observed your future choice. You know the box was filled based on that observation. Do you take one box or two? The causal decision theorist still says two. The contents are fixed. Your current choice cannot affect them. Take both. The evidential decision theorist still says one. The correlation between taking only box B and finding $1 million is perfect because the being filled the box based on direct observation of what you do. Taking only box B is evidence that you are in the world where box B is full. But the time travel version adds a new dimension. If the being observed your future choice, then your future choice is already fixed. You are going to choose whatever you are going to choose, and the being has already seen it. Your experience of deliberating right now, of weighing the arguments, of reading these words, and thinking about what the rational thing is the process that leads to a choice that has already been made in the being's observational timeline. This is not hypothetical anymore. If time travel exists and beings can observe future choices, then every deliberation occurs under these conditions. You are always already observed. Your choices are always already fixed in some observational timeline you have not yet reached. And the experience of choosing is the experience of a process whose outcome is already known to someone, even if not to you. The being filled the box based on what it saw. What it saw was you, deliberating, and then choosing. The deliberation was part of the process that produced the choice it observed. So the deliberation was not irrelevant to the outcome. It caused the outcome. It was just also observable in advance because time is accessible from outside in both directions. This is the full Newcomb situation with time travel. Your deliberation matters. Your character matters. What kind of person you are matters. And the outcome was already determined by those things before you started deliberating, both simultaneously. Not one instead of the other. That is not a contradiction. It is just a different picture of what deliberation and choice look like from the outside of a linear time frame. From the inside, you deliberate and then choose in a specific way, and act accordingly before you even begin. And the question of whether the being's prior knowledge removes your agency or leaves it intact is the same question as whether the determinism that most physicists accept removes your agency or leaves it intact, just made concrete by the presence of an actual observer who has actually seen your future. If you knew someone was watching you make this choice from the future, would you choose differently? And if you would, what does that tell you about what your choices are actually for? Maybe choices are for observers as much as for outcomes. Maybe the experience of deliberating and deciding is partly a performance for the future record of who you were. Maybe agency is always, in part, retrospective, justified by the history of choices that preceded it and by the coherence of that history as a story about a person with reasons. Newcomb's being, with perfect foreknowledge, just makes the observer explicit. In ordinary life, the observer is distributed across your future selves, who will remember this choice and build on it, across the people who will be affected by it, across the historical record of what this person did in this situation. The box is already filled, the observer has already left, but you are still here, still deliberating, still becoming the person the being observed. And that process, however determined its outcome may already be, is still the only way you have of being yourself. One more thread worth following through to the end. Newcomb's paradox has been used by some philosophers to argue that rationality itself is incoherent, that there is no single consistent account of what it means to reason well in all situations. The two dominant theories of rational decision-making give opposite answers to the same problem. No third theory has emerged that resolves the conflict while preserving the intuitions that make each of the original theories compelling. This is a startling conclusion. We tend to think of rationality as a single thing, a coherent set of principles for making good decisions, even if applying those principles is sometimes difficult. Newcomb's paradox suggests that this picture of rationality may be wrong, that there are genuinely different ways of being rational, ways that work well in most situations but diverge precisely at the points where they matter most, and that there is no higher-level principle for deciding which kind of rationality to apply when they conflict. If that is right, then the question of how to reason under Newcomb conditions is not a question with a correct answer. It is a question that reveals the limits of our current frameworks for rational decision-making. And those limits are not just technical. They connect to the deepest questions about free will, foreknowledge, causation, and what it means for a choice to be yours. In a universe where time travel makes perfect foreknowledge possible, these questions become practical rather than theoretical. You would encounter Newcomb situations regularly. Every interaction with a being that has observed your future choices would be a Newcomb game, and you would have to decide, over and over, which kind of rational to be. Most people, when they encounter Newcomb's paradox for the first time, feel the pull of both arguments. The two-boxer reasoning feels airtight. The one-boxer empirical record feels undeniable. The tension between them does not resolve. It just sits there, two incompatible certainties about the same situation, waiting for you to decide which one to trust. And in that waiting, in that specific quality of not knowing which framework to apply, there might be something honest about the situation, not a failure of reasoning, but an accurate perception of the limits of the tools you have. The box is full or empty. The being already knows which. You do not. And in that asymmetry of knowledge, in that gap between what you know and what is already determined, you have to act, not from certainty, not from a resolved account of what rationality requires, but from some combination of character, judgment, and willingness to be wrong, which is, perhaps, the only honest account of how any significant choice ever actually gets made. What does it mean to choose well when the correct answer is genuinely contested, and is living with that uncertainty, rather than resolving it, the most rational response available? The grandfather paradox. Every conversation about time travel eventually arrives here. Not because the grandfather paradox is the most subtle or the most physically sophisticated of the time travel paradoxes, but because it is the most fundamental. It gets at the basic question underlying all of the others. Can the past be changed at all? And if it cannot, what does that mean for everything we thought time travel would allow us to do? The setup is simple enough to state in a sentence. You travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he meets your grandmother. Your parent is therefore never born. You are therefore never born. But if you are never born, you cannot travel back in time to kill your grandfather. In which case your grandfather meets your grandmother, your parent is born, you are born, you build a time machine, you travel back, and you kill your grandfather. Around and around, with no stable point, no version of events that does not immediately contradict itself. The paradox is a logical loop with no exit. Every time you try to find a consistent story, you end up back where you started, having erased the premise that allowed you to get there. This is the grandfather paradox in its canonical form. Simple, clean, devastating, and responsible for enormous amounts of philosophical and physical work trying to figure out what it actually implies. The first and most obvious response is that the paradox proves time travel is impossible. If backward time travel were possible, it would enable actions that lead to logical contradictions. Logical contradictions cannot occur in reality. Therefore, backward time travel were possible. It would enable actions that lead to logical contradictions. Logical contradictions cannot occur in reality. Therefore, backward time travel is not possible. This is a reasonable argument, but it has an important limitation. It shows that certain specific uses of time travel are logically inconsistent. It does not obviously show that all backward time travel is impossible. Maybe time travel is possible, but the grandfather killing scenario specifically is not. Maybe the universe permits you to go back in time, but prevents you from doing anything that would create a paradox. Maybe the paradox is not evidence against time travel in general, but only against a particular kind of interference with the past. This is the route that many physicists and philosophers have taken. Instead of concluding that time travel is impossible, they have tried to characterize what time travel would be like if it were possible, and what constraints would have to hold to prevent paradoxes from arising. The most developed version of this approach is the Novikov self-consistency principle we mentioned in the context of the Polchinski Paradox. The principle states that the only events that can occur in the vicinity of closed time-like curves are those consistent with the global history of the universe. In practical terms, this means you can go back in time, but you cannot do anything that would create a paradox. The grandfather killing is simply not an event that the physics permits to occur near a closed time-like curve. You might try to do it, but something would always prevent you. Not any specific thing. Not a force or a guardian or a law, just the structure of physics, settling into the only consistent solution. On this account, if you travel back with the intention of killing your grandfather, you would fail. Not because your gun would jam necessarily, though it might, not because you would be stopped by a time police force, just because the physics of the situation does not admit a solution in which you succeed. You might try and find your aim is off, you might get distracted at the crucial moment, you might find that you simply cannot bring yourself to go through with it. The specific mechanism of failure is not guaranteed, but failure itself is, because success would be inconsistent with a universe that contains your arrival in the past. This resolution is internally consistent, but raises a deeply uncomfortable question about freedom. If you cannot do anything that would create a paradox, then there is a whole class of actions that are physically impossible for you in the vicinity of a closed time-like curve, not because any force prevents them, but because the structure of physics simply does not produce a consistent solution in which they occur. You are constrained in ways that are invisible and comprehensive. You can do anything consistent with the timeline you came from, and nothing else. That is a strange kind of freedom, not constrained by any rule you can articulate, not prevented by any mechanism you can observe, just gently, completely, invisibly limited to actions that do not break history, and you would not necessarily know which actions those are until you tried them and found they did not work. The grandfather paradox exposes this invisible constraint most dramatically because the killing is so definitive, so clearly inconsistent with the existence of the person attempting it. But the constraint is not limited to killing. Any action that would prevent your birth is off the table. Any action that would prevent the development of time travel is off the table. Any action that would prevent any of the specific events that led to your being there in the past is off the table. And the list of events that led to your being there is essentially everything that ever happened, because everything is causally connected to everything else over long time scales. Trying to change the past is, in a Novikov universe, like trying to change a sentence that has already been written. You can read the sentence. You can be present in the sentence, but you cannot revise it, because the sentence already includes everything you're going to do, including all your attempts to revise it. Some physicists find this unsatisfying, not because it is logically wrong, but because it seems to rule out the interesting uses of time travel. If you can only do things that are already part of the consistent history, then you cannot change anything. You cannot warn people of disasters. You cannot prevent atrocities. You cannot save anyone who was not already saved. You can only do things that were always going to happen, which means your time travel is not changing history, it is merely playing your assigned part in a history that was fixed before you arrived. This leads to a question that is not just physical but existential. What would be the point of time travel in a Novikov universe? Nothing. You could still observe the past directly, you could experience historical events firsthand, you could carry information forward, from your observations in the past to your report of them in the present, but you could not change anything that needed changing, because if it needed changing, it would have been changed, and if you had changed it, the change would already be part of the history you came from. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics offers a different resolution. On this view, every quantum event that could go multiple ways actually goes all ways, with the universe branching into separate timelines for each possible outcome. Backward time travel, on this interpretation, does not send you to the past of your own timeline. It sends you to a different branch, a parallel timeline with its own history. In this version, you can kill your grandfather without paradox. In the branch you arrive in, your grandfather never meets your grandmother. Your parent is never born. You are never born in that branch. But in the branch you came from, all of that still happened. You were born. You built the time machine. You went back. The two branches diverge from the moment of your arrival. No contradiction, because the timeline that produced you is not the timeline in which you are now acting. The many worlds resolution is appealing because it seems to restore genuine freedom of action. You can do anything in the timeline you arrive in, because your actions in that timeline do not affect the timeline that produced you. You cannot erase your own existence. You can only create a new branch in which a version of you that shares your history up to the departure point has a different history going forward. But this resolution also removes something. If you travel to a different branch and kill your grandfather there, you have not actually changed your past. You have changed someone else's past, in a branch that diverged from yours the moment you arrived. The grandfather you killed is not your grandfather in any meaningful sense. He is the grandfather of a person who will never exist in a timeline where you did not come from. So the many worlds resolution preserves consistency by decoupling the past you visit from the past that produced you. The price is that you can never actually reach your own past. Every time you go back, you land in a branch, and your own original timeline, with everything in it that you might want to change, remains forever inaccessible. Both resolutions to the grandfather paradox, self-consistency, and many worlds, involve a form of loss. Self-consistency preserves the integrity of the single timeline, but removes the freedom to change anything. Many worlds preserves freedom of action, but removes access to the specific past that produced you. This suggests that the grandfather paradox is pointing at something deeper than a logical puzzle about killing ancestors. It is pointing at a fundamental tension in what time travel is supposed to mean. The popular conception of time travel is that you can go back and interact with your own past, your actual history, the specific sequence of events that led to you being who you are, and you can change things there that will propagate forward and produce a different present. This conception is what makes time travel feel powerful and meaningful, the ability to reach back into your own story and revise it. But the grandfather paradox shows that this conception may be incoherent. If the past you reach is genuinely your past, the one that produced you, then you cannot change the things that were necessary for you to be there doing the changing. And if you can change anything, then either the timeline enforces consistency in ways that prevent meaningful change, or you are not reaching your actual past, but a parallel version of it that is not really yours in the relevant sense. In either case, the dream of going back and fixing things is frustrated, not by any external obstacle, by the logical structure of what going back and fixing things would have to mean. The grandfather paradox is, at its core, the paradox of wanting to reach your own origin and change it from the inside. You want to be the cause of a different version of your own cause. You want your existence to be the reason for a different kind of existence coming into being. And the paradox shows that this is not just practically difficult, it is conceptually problematic in a way that no amount of technological advancement can resolve. Because the you, who would go back and change things, is the product of the things that would be changed. Remove the origin, and you remove the product. Remove the product and there is no one to go back and remove the origin. The recursion has no stable point. This is not just about killing grandfathers. It applies to any significant intervention in the causal chain that produced you. Every experience that shaped who you are is a moment you would be unable to remove without also removing yourself. Every difficulty you would want to spare your past self is a difficulty that produced the person who wants to spare them. The grandfather paradox is finally, beneath all the physics, a paradox about gratitude, about whether you can wish your past had been different without wishing yourself different, about whether the person you are now, with all the wanting and the regret and the specific desires to change specific things, is separable from the process that produced them. You want to go back and fix things. The things you want to fix are what made you the person who wants to fix them. The fixable past and the wanting self are not independent. They produced each other. And the grandfather paradox is just the most extreme version of this mutual production, made explicit through the machinery of time travel. If you could really go back, and if the physics permitted genuine change rather than just consistency or branching, and if you could revise the moments you most want to revise, the person who emerged from the revised history would not be you in the sense you care about. They would be someone who did not go through the things you went through, someone without the specific shape of your regrets and your hard-won understanding. Someone who, looking back on their own history, might find different things they wish they could change. The past is not something that happened to you. The past is something you came from. And coming from it means it is constitutive of who you are in a way that backward time travel, if it were genuinely your past, would destroy by succeeding. The grandfather paradox knows this. The loop closes because self-erasure is incoherent, but maybe the loop closes for another reason too, because the self you would send back to do the erasing would not actually want to, not if they understood what they were erasing. And maybe that is the resolution that physics has been dancing around all along. Not that the timeline prevents the killing, but that the traveler, arriving in the past with full memory of what it cost to become the person standing there, would find they could not do it, not because anything stopped them, because they were finally close enough to the beginning to see what the beginning had made possible. And even with all the regret and all the pain that came after, they would not be able to bring themselves to reach back and close the door on all of it. The grandfather lives, not because the timeline protected him, but because the grandchild, in the end, could not quite go through with it. And the loop closes not through physics, but through the strange love that people sometimes discover they have for even the most painful parts of their own history, when they are finally standing close enough to the origin to really see what it was the origin of. Would you, given the machine and the moment, and the full weight of everything that came after, actually pull the trigger? And if you hesitated, even for a second, what would that hesitation be made of? There is a version of the grandfather paradox that operates not at the level of killing an ancestor, but at the level of information. And this version is in some ways more unsettling, because it does not require any violence, and because it applies to every time traveler regardless of their intentions. Imagine you travel back in time, not to kill anyone but simply to observe. You want to see a historical event with your own eyes. You choose a moment that changed the course of history, some pivotal scene in a long drama that you have studied and thought about and wanted to understand more fully. You arrive, you watch, you return to your own time. Here is the problem. You carried knowledge into the past, knowledge of what happens next, knowledge of the outcome of events that, in the past you visited, had not yet occurred. Your brain in the past contained information that did not exist in the past, information about futures that, from the perspective of the people you were observing, had not happened yet. You did not intervene. You did not change anything visible. But you were there, a physical presence in the causal web of that moment, carrying in your neurons patterns that encode knowledge of events that had not yet unfolded. You were a node of future information inserted into the past. And even if nothing you did propagated forward in the obvious sense, your presence in that moment, however silent, however careful, was a causal anomaly, a carrier of futures in a time before those futures were real. The information you carried back with you was not the same information you took with you. You observed things directly. Your understanding was updated by direct sensory experience rather than by the documentary record that survived. You know something now that nobody in your timeline knows, because you were there in a way that nobody else was. And that knowledge, carried forward in your memory, will subtly shape everything you do from this point. What you say, what you write, what you decide, how you see the world. You did not change the past, but the past changed you in ways that will ripple forward into your future, which is the past's future, which the past you visited had not yet reached. You are now a carrier of a direct historical experience that did not exist in any causal chain leading to the present before your trip. Your memory of being there is a new factor in the causal web. This is the informational grandfather paradox. Not a logical loop about self-erasure, but a subtler problem about the introduction of causal anomalies, even through the most passive possible form of time travel. You cannot observe the past without becoming part of the causal structure of the present that follows from the past. And you cannot become part of that causal structure without introducing a new causal factor that was not present before your trip. Every time traveler, however careful, however passive, however committed to non-interference, is an anomaly, a piece of the future inserted into the past, and the past, absorbing that piece, becomes a slightly different past than it would have been, which means the future that follows is a slightly different future, which might be the future that prompted the trip, which might then not prompt the trip in exactly the same way, which might produce a slightly different traveler. The loop does not close cleanly. The edges do not quite match, and over many iterations, the mismatch might accumulate into something significant, or it might not. The universe might be robust enough to absorb small informational anomalies without producing catastrophic divergences. The butterfly effects might be real, but negligible at the scale of the events that matter. History might have a kind of stability that absorbs perturbations without amplifying them indefinitely. But we do not know. We have never done this. We have no data on how robust causal chains are to the injection of future observers into the past. And the grandfather paradox, in all its versions, is a reminder that the question is not merely whether time travel is physically possible. It is whether a universe that permits time travel is a universe that can remain coherent while doing so. The grandfather paradox has been with us long enough that it can feel like an old acquaintance, a familiar puzzle with a familiar shape. You can walk through the logic quickly, wave at the various resolutions, and move on. But there is something worth sitting with in the image at the center of it. A person standing in the past, facing the man whose existence is the foundation of their own, holding the power to end that existence, and thereby, through the strangest of logical spirals, end themselves. What would that moment actually feel like? Not as a thought experiment, but as a human experience. The past person would be real, not a symbol, not an abstraction, but a specific human being, with a face and a voice and a particular way of moving through the world. And the traveler looking at them would be the specific product of everything that person made possible through their existence. The logic of the paradox says the situation is impossible because it is self-contradictory, but something older and stranger than logic might also be at work. The product of a person, standing in the presence of that person's existence before the product was made, might find that the paradox they came to create is not just logically incoherent, but humanly impossible in a way that logic does not quite capture. Not because the timeline prevents it, not because physics steps in, but because whatever shaped you into someone who would travel back in time, who would care enough about something to try to change the past, also shaped you into someone who, when the moment arrives, finds that they cannot. The grandfather paradox resolves itself not through physics, but through what the trip reveals about the traveler. And what it reveals might be the same thing every encounter with the origin of something reveals. That origins, even painful ones, even ones you would have chosen differently if you could, are not things you can look at directly and then destroy. You wanted to go back and change things. You built the machine. You made the trip. And now you are here, standing close enough to the beginning to see what the beginning was. And the question that the grandfather paradox leaves you with is not whether the physics permits the killing. It is whether the person standing there, in the past, with everything that made them who they are finally visible up close, actually still wants to. And if they do not, if the hesitation is real, then the paradox was never really about causality. It was about what it means to understand where you came from, and what that understanding does to the version of yourself that was certain, a moment ago, that they knew exactly what needed to be changed. The grandfather sits in his chair. He is younger than you have ever seen him in photographs. He has not yet made the choices that led to your parent, to you, to everything. He does not know you are there. He is just a person, living his life, having no idea what he will eventually be the origin of. You have the machine. You have the moment. You have the full weight of everything that came after. What do you do with it? And whoever you were when you arrived, are you still that person now? Or did something happen, in the act of getting close enough to really look, that changed the answer to a question you thought was already settled? Maybe that is what time travel is really for. Not to change the past, but to finally see it clearly enough to understand why you are the person who wanted to. And in that understanding, perhaps, to find that the wanting was always the most honest part. And the past, for all its weight and all its pain, was the thing that made you the specific kind of person who could travel back to face it. The loop closes, not because physics required it, but because standing at the origin, you realized that the origin was not the problem you thought it was. It was the beginning of everything that eventually made you someone who could see that. And that, quietly, is enough.